Ship of Theseus. Imagine standing in an ancient harbour, watching as craftsmen carefully remove a weathered plank from a legendary ship. They replace it with fresh timber, perfectly fitted and gleaming in the morning light. The ship looks almost unchanged, yet something profound has shifted in that quiet moment of repair. Over the months that follow, you return to witness more replacements. Another plank, then the mast, then the sail, each piece methodically removed and substituted with new materials. Eventually, every single component that once made up the original vessel has been replaced, yet the ship still bears the same name and serves the same purpose. But here's where your mind begins to wander into deeper waters. Is this still the same ship you first encountered? Or have you been watching the birth of something entirely new? This is the Ship of Theseus, one of philosophy's most enduring puzzles about identity and continuity. Named after the mythical Greek hero whose ship was preserved by the Athenians, this paradox asks a seemingly simple question that unravels into profound complexity. If every part of something is gradually replaced, does it remain the same thing? The strangeness lies not in the question itself, but in how our intuitions pull us in opposite directions, leaving us suspended between equally compelling answers. On one hand, you might argue that the ship retains its essential identity throughout the process of replacement. After all, the changes happen gradually, one piece at a time, and at no single moment does the ship suddenly transform into something else. The function remains the same, the form stays consistent, and there's an unbroken chain of continuity connecting the original vessel to its current state. This feels right in the way that your body remains yours, despite the fact that most of your cells are replaced over time. But then another voice in your mind whispers a different truth. If every single component has been replaced, how can this possibly be the same ship? None of the original material remains, not a splinter, not a nail, not a thread of sail. The ship you're looking at now is composed entirely of parts that never existed in the original vessel. By this logic, you're staring at an elaborate replica, a faithful copy, that shares nothing physical with the ship that once carried Theseus across ancient seas. The paradox deepens when you consider what philosophers call the double ship scenario. Imagine that instead of discarding the old planks, the craftsmen carefully preserve each removed piece. Over time, as they complete their renovations on the harbour ship, another group of workers takes these original, weathered components and reassembles them into a complete vessel. Now you have two ships, one made entirely of new parts but maintaining continuous existence, and another made entirely of original parts but assembled after a gap in time. Which one is the true Ship of Theseus? Your mind might feel caught in an impossible loop as you consider both vessels. The continuously repaired ship has never ceased to exist, never stopped being a ship, never lost its identity through time. Yet the reassembled ship contains the actual wood, the actual nails, the actual fabric that Theseus once touched. One has continuity without original substance. The other has original substance without continuity. Both claims to authenticity seem equally valid, equally impossible to dismiss. This paradox extends far beyond ancient ships into the very fabric of human experience. You face the same puzzle when you look in the mirror each morning. The cells in your skin have been replaced countless times since childhood. Your bones have rebuilt themselves. Your blood has been renewed. Even your brain, the seat of your consciousness, has undergone constant change at the molecular level. Are you the same person who learned to walk, who felt first love, who made promises years ago? Or are you a continuity of experience inhabiting an entirely new physical form? The question becomes even more poignant when you consider relationships. The person you love today carries the same name and memories as the person you met years ago. Yet every atom in their body may have changed. Their thoughts have evolved, their dreams have shifted, their very essence has been shaped by countless experiences. Do you love the same person, or have you been falling in love again and again with someone who shares only continuity with your original beloved? Memory itself becomes a ship of Theseus in this light. Each time you recall a moment from your past, neuroscientists tell us, you're not accessing a static recording but reconstructing the memory anew. With each reconstruction, subtle changes creep in, details shift, emotions evolve, perspectives mature. Over time, your memory of an event may share little with the original experience, except the thread of continuity. You remember remembering, each iteration a plank replaced in the ship of your past. Perhaps the beauty of this paradox lies not in finding a definitive answer, but in how it illuminates the fluid nature of identity itself. When you stop demanding that things be either same or different, and instead allow them to exist in the space between, something profound shifts in your understanding. The ship is neither purely continuous nor entirely new. It exists in the dynamic tension between these poles, much like everything else in a universe defined by constant change. You begin to see that identity itself might be less about static essence and more about pattern and relationship. The ship maintains its identity not because of its material components, but through the relationships between its parts, the patterns they create, the function they serve together. When a plank is replaced, it's not the wood that matters, but how that new piece fits into the existing pattern, how it maintains the relationships that define shipness. This perspective offers a gentler way of understanding change in your own life. You don't need to cling to every aspect of who you were to remain authentically yourself. Like the ship, you can allow parts of your identity to be replaced. Old beliefs, outdated dreams, former ways of being, while maintaining the essential pattern that makes you who you are. Growth becomes not a loss of self, but a careful renovation, a thoughtful replacement of what no longer serves while preserving what matters most. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let your mind float on these questions without needing to anchor them to solid answers. The Ship of Theseus reminds us that some puzzles are meant to be lived rather than solved, experienced rather than explained. In the gentle space between waking and sleeping, between same and different, between who you were and who you're becoming, you might find a kind of peace in the paradox itself. It's not about determining whether the ship is truly the same or truly different. It's about noticing how beautifully it continues to sail. Grandfather paradox. Imagine you're standing in the dusty corner of an old attic, surrounded by forgotten photographs and yellowed letters. Your grandfather's watch ticks quietly in your palm, its steady rhythm carrying the weight of decades. The sunlight filtering through the window seems to bend time itself, and suddenly you find yourself wondering, what if you could step backward through those golden rays, walk into the past, and change everything that brought you here? But then you pause, struck by a strange and troubling thought. If you change the past, would you still exist to make that change? This is the grandfather paradox, one of the most haunting puzzles that emerges when we dare to imagine traveling backward through time. The concept is deceptively simple. If you could journey to the past and prevent your grandparents from ever meeting, you would never be born. But if you were never born, how could you have traveled back in time in the first place? It's a logical loop that seems to fold in on itself, creating a contradiction so fundamental that it challenges our basic understanding of cause and effect. On one hand, the logic appears ironclad. Every action has consequences that ripple forward through time like stones thrown into still water. You exist because your grandparents met, fell in love, and had children. Remove that meeting, and the entire chain of events that led to your existence simply vanishes. Yet on the other hand, the very premise requires that you already exist in order to travel back and make the change. It's as if time itself is playing an elaborate trick, presenting you with an impossible puzzle where the solution erases the problem, and erasing the problem eliminates the solution. Perhaps you begin to wonder if time has a way of protecting itself from such paradoxes. Some theories suggest that the universe might be far more resilient than we imagine, that any attempt to change the past would be met with increasingly improbable coincidences that preserve the original timeline. Your grandparents would meet despite your interference, drawn together by forces that seem to transcend your small attempts at disruption. The meeting might happen at a different cafe, on a different street, but somehow the rivers of time would find a way to flow back to their destined course. But then another possibility emerges, one that's perhaps even more unsettling. What if changing the past doesn't erase the original timeline, but instead creates a branch, a parallel world where you never existed, while you remain trapped as a visitor from a reality that no longer connects to this one? You would become a ghost from another possibility, watching a world where your parents grew up as only children, where your friends have different friends, where every small ripple of your absence has created an entirely different ocean. The paradox deepens when you consider the nature of change itself. Even the act of traveling to the past would alter it in countless microscopic ways. Your presence would displace air molecules. Your feet would compress blades of grass. Your breath would add moisture to the atmosphere. These tiny changes would compound over time, growing into enormous differences through what scientists call the butterfly effect. You wouldn't need to prevent your grandparents from meeting. Simply existing in their past might be enough to unravel the delicate chain of events that led to your birth. Yet there's something almost beautiful in this impossibility, isn't there? The grandfather paradox reveals time not as a simple river flowing in one direction, but as something far more mysterious and interconnected. It suggests that the past, present, and future might be woven together in ways that protect the fabric of existence from the kinds of tears that logical contradictions would create. Perhaps the universe has a kind of wisdom, an inherent structure that prevents the impossible while still allowing us to imagine it. The paradox also invites you to consider the strange nature of your own existence. Every moment of your life depends on an almost infinite chain of precisely timed events stretching back through history. If your great-grandmother had taken a different route to work on a particular Tuesday in 1924, if an ancient ancestor had sheltered under a different tree during a storm, if any of a million small decisions had been made differently, you might never have come to be. The grandfather paradox makes this fragility tangible, showing you just how precarious and precious the specific sequence of events that led to your consciousness really is. When you sit quietly with this paradox, it begins to transform from a logical puzzle into something more like a meditation on identity and time. Who are you, really, if your existence depends so completely on events that happened long before you were born? Are you the inevitable result of those events, or are you something more? A consciousness that somehow transcends the particular circumstances that brought it into being? The paradox doesn't answer these questions, but it holds them gently, like cupping water in your hands. Perhaps that's the most profound gift of the grandfather paradox. It doesn't demand to be solved so much as contemplated. It invites you to marvel at the mysterious nature of time, causation, and your own existence. In the end, it's not really about time travel or logical contradictions. It's about recognizing the beautiful impossibility of trying to step outside the flow of time that gave birth to you. It's about noticing how every moment contains all the moments that came before it, and find peace in that endless, unbreakable connection. The Sourite's Paradox. Imagine yourself standing before a magnificent sand dune, golden grains stretching endlessly beneath the afternoon sun. You reach down and gather a single grain of sand between your fingers, rolling it gently against your thumb. This tiny speck, smaller than a pinhead, catches the light for just a moment before you let it fall back to the earth. Now you find yourself wondering something that has puzzled philosophers for over 2,000 years. When does a collection of individual grains transform into what we confidently call a heap? The Sourite's Paradox presents us with a deceptively simple puzzle about the boundaries of our everyday concepts. Named after the ancient Greek word for heap, this paradox begins with an obvious truth. A single grain of sand is not a heap. Surely, adding one more grain won't suddenly create a heap either. Yet somewhere in this process of adding grain after grain, heap after grain, we must cross an invisible threshold where non-heap becomes heap. The strange part is that this threshold seems to exist everywhere and nowhere at once, challenging our most basic assumptions about how we categorize the world around us. You might think the solution is simply to pick a number. Perhaps exactly 1,000 grains make a heap, you decide, but this creates its own peculiar problems. If 1,000 grains form a heap, then 999 grains do not. The difference between heap and non-heap becomes a single grain of sand, which seems absurdly arbitrary. Would you really look at 999 grains and declare confidently that this collection lacks some essential heapness that appears the moment grain number 1,000 joins the pile? The paradox extends far beyond sand dunes and ancient philosophy. You encounter Sourites-like puzzles constantly in your daily life, though you might not notice them. When does a child become an adult? When does day become night? When does a person become bald, or wealthy, or wise? Each of these transformations seems gradual and continuous. Yet our language demands sharp categories. We need words like adult and night and bald to communicate effectively, even though the boundaries of these concepts resist precise definition. Consider the question of personal identity through this lens. You were once a baby, completely dependent and barely conscious in ways we might recognize. That baby grew into a child, the child into a teenager, the teenager into the person reading these words right now. At what exact moment did you become you? When did the collection of cells, memories, and experiences transform into the coherent self you recognize in the mirror? The paradox suggests that this transformation, like the formation of a heap, might be both real and impossible to pinpoint. On one hand, the Sourite's Paradox seems to reveal a fundamental flaw in human reasoning. Our brains appear designed to create categories and boundaries in a world that often flows continuously from one state to another. We seem to be pattern-seeking creatures living in a pattern-resistant universe, forever trying to impose our neat divisions onto messy reality. This creates a kind of cognitive tension that the paradox brings into sharp relief. On the other hand, perhaps the paradox reveals something profound about the nature of meaning itself. Maybe the boundaries we draw aren't arbitrary mistakes, but necessary fictions that allow us to navigate complexity. When you call something a heap, you're not making a precise scientific measurement. You're engaging in a collaborative act of meaning-making, one that depends as much on context and purpose as on objective reality. The heap exists in the space between the sand and the mind observing it. The emotional dimension of the Sourite's Paradox often goes unnoticed, yet it touches something deep in the human experience. There's a melancholy beauty in recognizing that the categories we rely on are more fragile than they appear. The moment when someone you love transitions from healthy to sick, from present to absent, from familiar to strange, rarely announces itself clearly. These transitions happen grain by grain, day by day, until one morning you wake up and realize that something fundamental has shifted without your permission. Yet there's also comfort in the paradox's gentle insistence that boundaries are more fluid than we pretend. If the line between child and adult is blurry, then perhaps there's no rush to cross it. If the boundary between success and failure is undefined, then perhaps failure is less final than it appears. The paradox whispers that the sharp edges of our categories might be softer than we feared, more forgiving than we dared to hope. Ancient philosophers proposed various solutions to the Sourite's paradox, each illuminating different aspects of the puzzle. Some suggested that vague concepts simply don't have precise boundaries, and we should accept this vagueness as a fundamental feature of language. Others argued that there are precise boundaries, but we can't know where they lie. Still others proposed that the paradox reveals the limitations of classical logic itself, pointing toward more nuanced ways of reasoning about uncertain and gradual transitions. Modern attempts to resolve the paradox have grown increasingly sophisticated, involving probability theory, fuzzy logic, and complex mathematical models. Yet somehow the paradox retains its peculiar power to unsettle and intrigue. Perhaps this persistence suggests that the Sourite's paradox isn't really a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived with. A reminder of the strange relationship between our minds and the world they try to comprehend. As you drift towards sleep tonight, you might find your thoughts returning to that imaginary sand dune where this journey began. Picture the grains shifting gently in an evening breeze, sometimes clustering into small piles, sometimes scattering across the broader landscape. There's something hypnotic about this image, something that matches the rhythm of thoughts settling into rest. Each grain is distinct, yet part of something larger. Each moment of consciousness separate yet flowing into the next. The paradox becomes a kind of meditation on the nature of change itself. Nothing transforms suddenly. Everything transforms constantly. The boundaries we draw are real enough to matter and fluid enough to surprise us. Perhaps wisdom lies not in resolving this tension, but in learning to dance with it, to find stability in the midst of constant change, to create meaning without demanding permanence. The Sourite's paradox ultimately invites you to embrace a gentler way of thinking about categories and boundaries. It suggests that the world might be more forgiving than your anxious mind sometimes believes, more flexible than your rigid definitions allow. It's not about solving the paradox or finding the exact point where sand becomes heap. It's about noticing how meaning emerges gradually, beautifully, grain by grain, in the space between what is and what we call it. The barber paradox. You're standing in a quiet village square, watching the morning light filter through ancient cobblestones. There's a small barber shop on the corner, its red and white poles spinning lazily in the gentle breeze. The barber inside is a friendly man who has lived here his entire life, serving the community with steady hands and careful attention. But as you watch him work, a strange question begins to form in your mind, one that will unravel the very fabric of logic itself. This is the barber paradox, a thought experiment that seems deceptively simple, but contains within it a fundamental contradiction that has puzzled philosophers and mathematicians for over a century. The paradox asks us to consider a barber who shaves only those men in his village who do not shave themselves. It sounds straightforward enough until you ask the crucial question, who shaves the barber? You begin to work through the logic, step by careful step. If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves. But according to our definition, the barber only shaves men who do not shave themselves. So if he shaves himself, he shouldn't be shaving himself. The contradiction emerges like a shadow at noon, impossible to ignore, yet seemingly impossible to exist. On the other hand, perhaps the barber doesn't shave himself. This would place him in the category of men who do not shave themselves. But our barber shaves all men who don't shave themselves, which means he must shave himself. Once again, we arrive at a contradiction, as if we're walking in circles through a maze with no exit. You find yourself caught in this logical loop, where every path leads back to the same impossible junction. The barber cannot shave himself, and he cannot not shave himself. Both possibilities lead to their own negation, like a snake endlessly devouring its own tail. This isn't merely a word game or clever riddle. It's a window into something profound about the nature of logic and language. The paradox reveals the dangerous territory we enter when we allow sets to contain themselves as members. In this case, we're asking whether the set of all men who don't shave themselves can include the barber as a member. The answer creates a logical explosion, where truth and falsehood become indistinguishable. It's as if we've discovered a place where the rules that govern rational thought simply break down. You might wonder why this matters beyond the confines of academic philosophy. But the barber paradox is more than an intellectual curiosity. It's a mirror reflecting the fundamental limitations of logical systems. When Bertrand Russell first formulated this paradox in the early 1900s, it sent shockwaves through the mathematical community. Entire foundations of set theory had to be rebuilt, new axioms created to prevent such contradictions from emerging. In a deeper sense, the paradox speaks to the human condition itself. We are creatures who constantly define ourselves in relation to others, creating categories and boundaries that sometimes trap us in impossible positions. How often do you find yourself caught between conflicting definitions of who you should be? Consider the person who defines themselves as completely selfless, someone who never thinks of their own needs. But the very act of maintaining this identity requires constant self-awareness and self-regulation. They must think about themselves in order to not think about themselves. Like the barber, they become trapped in a logical impossibility, unable to fulfill their own definition without violating it. The paradox illuminates the recursive nature of self-reference that permeates human experience. We are observers observing ourselves, thinkers thinking about thinking, beings aware of our own awareness. Each layer of reflection creates the possibility for new contradictions, new impossible loops, where meaning begins to dissolve at the edges. You begin to sense something beautiful in this dissolution, something that transcends the need for logical resolution. Perhaps the barber paradox isn't meant to be solved, but rather experienced as a koan, a meditation on the limits of rational thought. In Zen tradition, students are given impossible problems precisely to exhaust the analytical mind and open space for a different kind of understanding. The village barber continues his work, unaware that he has become a symbol for one of philosophy's most enduring mysteries. His hands move with practiced certainty, shaving cheek and chin with the confidence of someone who has never questioned whether he can exist. There's something profound in this image. The gap between lived experience and logical analysis, between being and thinking about being. In the end, you realize that the paradox is less about barbershops and more about the strange loops that consciousness creates when it turns its attention on itself. We are all barbers in Russell's village, caught between impossible definitions, navigating contradictions that have no clean resolution. The beauty lies not in solving the puzzle, but in recognizing how it reflects the fundamental mystery of existence itself. As you watch the barber's reflection in his shop window, multiplied infinitely between facing mirrors, you understand that some questions are more valuable than their answers. The paradox becomes a gentle teacher, reminding you that logic, while powerful, is just one way of engaging with reality. Sometimes the most profound truths emerge not from resolution, but from learning to rest comfortably in the space between contradictions, where mystery and wonder quietly flourish. Epimenides' paradox. Imagine you're walking through an ancient Greek marketplace, the sun casting long shadows between marble columns. A philosopher approaches you with weathered hands and knowing eyes, and speaks a single sentence that stops you in your tracks. All Cretans are liars, he says, and I am from Crete. You stand there, mind suddenly spinning, as the simple words create an impossible knot in your thoughts. Can a liar tell you that he's lying? This is the heart of the Epimenides paradox, one of the oldest and most enduring puzzles in human thought. Named after the ancient Cretan philosopher who supposedly first posed it, this paradox creates a logical loop with no clear exit. If Epimenides is telling the truth when he says all Cretans are liars, then as a Cretan, he must be lying, which means his statement is false. But if his statement is false, then maybe not all Cretans are liars, which could mean he's telling the truth after all. The paradox reveals something profound about the slippery nature of truth and self-reference, showing us how language can tie itself into impossible knots. You begin to see how the paradox works its quiet magic on your mind. On one hand, you want to believe that every statement is either true or false, a principle that seems as fundamental as breathing. This is how we navigate the world, sorting experiences into categories, building understanding on solid ground. Yet here stands this ancient puzzle, refusing to fit neatly into either box, like water that won't hold its shape in your hands. On the other hand, the paradox invites you to question the very foundations of logic itself. Perhaps the problem isn't with Epimenides or his statement, but with our assumption that all meaningful sentences must be definitively true or false. Maybe some statements exist in a strange twilight zone, neither fully true nor completely false, but something altogether different. The paradox becomes a doorway into uncertainty, where the familiar rules of thought begin to bend and shift. Consider how this puzzle echoes through your daily life in smaller, gentler ways. When you say, "I'm terrible at giving compliments," are you giving yourself a compliment about your honesty, creating a tiny paradox of self-awareness? When someone declares, "I never exaggerate," their very certainty might contradict their claim. These moments reveal how self-reference creates strange loops in consciousness, places where the mind observes itself observing itself, creating infinite mirrors of awareness. The paradox also illuminates the curious relationship between identity and truth-telling. If you define yourself as someone who always lies, can that definition itself be trusted? It's like trying to use a broken ruler to measure its own accuracy, or asking a mirror to reflect on the nature of reflection. The tool of measurement becomes entangled with what it's measuring, creating a beautiful confusion that resists easy resolution. You might find yourself wondering about the nature of categories themselves. The statement, "all Cretans are liars," attempts to place every person from Crete into a single box. But what if human nature is more fluid than that? Perhaps some Cretans lie sometimes, tell the truth other times, or speak in ways that transcend the simple binary of truth and falsehood. The paradox might be revealing not just a logical puzzle, but the limitations of absolute statements about complex human beings. There's something deeply human about our relationship with this ancient conundrum. For over 2 millennia, philosophers mathematicians, and curious minds have wrestled with its implications, each generation finding new layers to explore. The paradox connects you to a vast conversation that spans cultures and centuries, a shared bewilderment that transcends time. It reminds us that some questions are more valuable for their asking than their answering. The paradox also speaks to the mystery of self-knowledge. When you make statements about your own nature, your own reliability, your own character, you're engaged in the same kind of self-reference that creates the Cretan puzzle. I know myself well, you might say, but how can the self be both the knower and the known? The paradox suggests that complete self-transparency might be as impossible as a perfectly accurate statement about the nature of all statements. In the gentle realm of sleep and dreams, perhaps the paradox finds its most natural home. Dreams regularly present us with impossible situations that we accept without question, realities that contradict themselves with fluid grace. In dreams, you might be simultaneously yourself and someone else, in familiar places that are somehow completely strange. The dreaming mind doesn't demand logical consistency in the way the waking mind does, allowing contradictions to coexist peacefully. The Epimenides paradox invites you to embrace this dreamlike acceptance of uncertainty. Rather than fighting to resolve the contradiction, you can let it exist as it is, a beautiful example of how language and logic can create their own poetry. Like a Zen koan that resists rational solution, the paradox points beyond itself towards something larger and more mysterious than mere logical correctness. As your thoughts begin to soften around the edges of this ancient puzzle, you might notice how the urgency to solve it fades into something more peaceful. The paradox becomes less a problem to be conquered and more a companion to be appreciated, a reminder that not everything in existence needs to be pinned down and categorized. Some mysteries are meant to be lived with rather than solved, carried gently in the mind like a smooth stone in your pocket. The truth about truth itself might be more paradoxical than we ever imagined. Perhaps reality is comfortable with contradiction in ways that human logic struggles to accept. Perhaps the universe itself operates on principles that include and transcend the simple binaries we use to organize our thoughts. The Cretan philosophers' ancient words continue to whisper across the centuries, inviting each new listener into the beautiful confusion of being human. It's not about finally solving whether Epimenides was lying or telling the truth, but about noticing how the question itself opens doorways in the mind. In that opening, in that gentle bewilderment, something deeper than logic begins to stir, something that doesn't need answers to feel complete. The twin paradox. Imagine you're standing at a space station's observation deck, watching two identical twins prepare for a journey that will test the very fabric of time itself. One twin boards a spacecraft capable of traveling at nearly the speed of light, while the other remains on Earth, waving goodbye through the vast window of space. As the ship accelerates into the cosmic darkness, you witness something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the nature of time. Which twin will age faster? And why does the answer seem to contradict itself depending on whose perspective you choose? The twin paradox presents us with one of the most elegant contradictions in modern physics, born from Einstein's theory of special relativity. According to this theory, time moves more slowly for objects traveling at high speeds relative to a stationary observer. So when one twin travels to a distant star at near light speed while the other remains on Earth, each should observe the other's clock running slowly. The paradox emerges from this mutual observation. If both twins see each other's time moving more slowly, who will actually be younger when they reunite? On one hand, you have the earthbound twin, watching through powerful telescopes as his brother's ship races toward distant stars. From his perspective, his travelling brother's clocks tick more slowly, his movements appear sluggish, and his aging process crawls at a fraction of its normal rate. The equations of special relativity seem crystal clear. His brother should return younger, having experienced less time during the journey. On the other hand, you have the space-travelling twin, looking back at Earth through his ship's windows. From his reference frame, it's the Earth that's moving away at tremendous speed, carrying his brother along with it. By the same logic of time dilation, shouldn't the Earth-bound twin's clocks appear to run slowly? Shouldn't his brother be the one aging more slowly? The symmetry creates a puzzle that seems to trap logic in an endless loop. The resolution lies hidden in the subtle asymmetry of the journey itself. You begin to notice that while both twins observe each other moving, their experiences aren't truly equivalent. The travelling twin must accelerate away from Earth, decelerate at his destination, accelerate back toward home, and decelerate upon arrival. These periods of acceleration break the symmetry, creating moments where the simple rules of special relativity give way to more complex considerations. During those crucial acceleration phases, the travelling twin experiences something his earthbound brother never does. From the ship's perspective, the universe itself seems to shift and warp. Distant clocks appear to speed up dramatically during acceleration, then slow down again during deceleration. It's as if the traveller witnesses time itself breathing, expanding and contracting with each change in velocity. You might wonder why these brief acceleration periods matter so much when the majority of the journey occurs at constant velocity. The answer reveals something profound about the nature of space-time itself. Those moments of acceleration aren't just changes in speed, they're transitions between different reference frames, different ways of slicing through the four-dimensional fabric of reality. Each transition reveals that simultaneity, the very concept of now, isn't universal but depends on your motion through space. The mathematical resolution confirms what intuition might whisper. The travelling twin returns younger, having experienced less proper time during the journey. But this answer only deepens the paradox's emotional resonance. You realise you're not just observing a quirk of physics, but confronting fundamental questions about identity, experience, and the passage of time itself. Consider the moment when the twins reunite after decades of separation. They share the same genes, the same childhood memories, the same family history. Yet one has lived through fewer heartbeats, fewer sunrises, fewer moments of conscious experience. Which twin has lived more fully? The one who accumulated more calendar years, or the one who journeyed across the cosmos? Their reunion becomes a mirror, reflecting the strange relationship between time as we measure it and time as we experience it. The paradox extends beyond physics into the realm of human connection. Imagine the earthbound twin who has watched seasons change, relationships evolve, and society transform, while his brother remained frozen in relative youth. Imagine the travelling twin, returning to find that everyone he knew has aged beyond recognition, that the world has moved forward in ways he can barely comprehend. Who has gained more, and who has lost more? You find yourself contemplating whether this is really about time at all, or about the deeper question of what it means to exist in relation to others. The twin paradox suggests that our experience of time isn't just personal, but fundamentally relational. We age not just in isolation, but in connection with the people and places that anchor our sense of self in the flowing river of moments. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the paradox isn't the physics, but the realization that every choice involves a similar trade-off. Every path you take through life means leaving other paths unexplored. Every moment you spend in one place is a moment you can't spend in another. The twins simply make visible what's always been true. That time isn't a universal river carrying us all at the same rate, but an ocean where each of us swims at our own pace, shaped by the currents of our choices. As you drift deeper into contemplation, the technical details of reference frames and acceleration begin to fade into something more essential. The twin paradox isn't really about solving the mathematics of space-time curvature. It's about recognizing that the universe is stranger and more beautiful than our everyday experience suggests. It's about noticing that even our most fundamental assumptions about time, about aging, about what it means to exist alongside others, deserve to be questioned with wonder rather than certainty. In the end, perhaps both twins are right in their own reference frames, just as you are right in yours. The paradox doesn't resolve into a single truth, but opens into a space where multiple perspectives can coexist, where contradictions become invitations to see more deeply, rather than problems to be eliminated. Time becomes not a constraint, but a canvas, painted differently by each observer, yet somehow revealing the same underlying mystery about what it means to move through this strange, interconnected cosmos together. Zeno's arrow. Imagine you're standing in an ancient Greek courtyard, watching an archer draw back their bow. The arrow sits perfectly still against the string, poised and ready. In the next moment, it will fly through the air toward its target. But here's what stops you cold. If you could freeze any single instant of that arrow's flight, any snapshot of time, wouldn't the arrow be motionless in that frozen moment? And if every moment is made of such frozen instants, how does the arrow ever actually move? This is the heart of Zeno's arrow paradox, one of the most haunting puzzles ever conceived about motion and time. The ancient philosopher Zeno of Elea proposed that at any given instant, a moving arrow occupies a space exactly equal to its own size, no more, no less. In that instant, it cannot be moving, because movement requires change over time, and an instant has no duration. Yet somehow, mysteriously, the arrow reaches its target. The paradox forces us to question whether motion itself might be an illusion, a trick our minds play as we string together countless motionless moments. On one hand, Zeno's logic feels airtight. You can picture it clearly. Pause the world at any fraction of a second, and everything freezes like a photograph. The arrow hangs suspended, occupying its exact space, neither approaching nor receding from anything. It simply exists, static and defined. If reality is composed of such discrete moments, like frames in a film reel, then motion becomes nothing more than a series of stationary positions, each one as fixed as a statue. On the other hand, your everyday experience screams otherwise. You've seen countless arrows fly, balls roll, leaves fall. You've felt the wind on your face as you've walked, sensed the continuous flow of movement through space. The paradox creates a strange doubling of reality, the logical world where nothing can move, and the lived world where everything does. You begin to wonder if there's something fundamentally wrong with how we think about time itself, as if we're trying to capture a river by freezing it into ice. Consider what happens when you try to locate the exact moment of change. You're watching that arrow again, and you decide to find the precise instant it transitions from one position to the next. But as you zoom in closer and closer to that moment, it seems to slip away from you. The transition doesn't happen in any single instant. It's spread across time like butter across bread. Yet without individual instants, what would time even be? This is where the paradox begins to feel less like a logic puzzle and more like a meditation on the mystery of existence itself. The paradox also reveals something strange about how we measure and divide reality. When you slice time into smaller and smaller pieces, looking for the building blocks of motion, you discover that motion disappears entirely. It's like trying to find wetness by examining individual water molecules, or trying to locate a song by studying the silence between notes. The whole becomes something qualitatively different from its parts, something that can't be rebuilt by simply adding the pieces back together. Perhaps what Zeno's arrow really illuminates is the gap between our analytical minds and our lived experience. Your rational mind wants to break everything down into components, to understand the universe by taking it apart piece by piece. But movement, time, and change might be fundamental aspects of reality that can't survive such dissection. They exist in the connections, the relationships, the flowing between states, rather than in the states themselves. This speaks to something deeper about consciousness and perception. You don't experience life as a series of frozen snapshots, even though your brain processes information in discrete neural firings. Somehow, the biological machinery of awareness creates the seamless sense of flowing time and continuous motion. The paradox suggests that what we call reality might be an emergent property of something far more complex than we can grasp by looking at individual moments, like trying to understand a symphony by analyzing single notes in isolation. There's something almost musical about how the paradox resolves, or rather, how it teaches us to live with irresolution. Like a jazz musician who finds beauty in the tension between notes, you can learn to appreciate the strange space where logic and experience don't quite align. The arrow flies because it must, because flight is written into the fabric of existence in ways that transcend our ability to capture it in words or formulas. When you sit with this paradox long enough, it begins to change how you see other aspects of life. How does love grow gradually when each moment of feeling is distinct? How do you age continuously when each day you're essentially the same person as the day before? How does a conversation flow when it's made of separate words, separate thoughts, separate breaths? The paradox whispers that perhaps the most important qualities of existence, growth, change, connection, meaning, emerge from the spaces between definable moments. The ancient Greeks gave us this paradox not as a problem to solve, but as a window into the fundamental strangeness of being alive in time. Every morning, you wake up in a universe where arrows fly and time flows, where motion is both impossible and inevitable, where logic and experience dance together in ways that reason cannot fully choreograph. The paradox invites you to rest in this mystery rather than resolve it, to let your mind settle into the gentle impossibility of existence itself. It's not about finding the flaw in Zeno's reasoning or proving that motion really exists. It's about noticing how reality operates beyond the boundaries of what language and logic can contain, how life unfolds in the tender spaces between thoughts, how the deepest truths often live in the questions rather than the answers. The lottery paradox. Imagine you're holding a lottery ticket in your hand, one among millions printed for tonight's drawing. The paper feels ordinary between your fingers, thin, slightly rough, with numbers that seemed random when you chose them. You know with absolute certainty that this ticket will not win. The odds are astronomically against you, so remote that believing otherwise would seem foolish. Yet somewhere, in this vast sea of identical certainty, one ticket holds the key to fortune. How can every ticket be destined to lose when logic demands that one must win? The lottery paradox reveals a strange crack in how we think about probability and belief. Each individual ticket, yours included, has such a minuscule chance of winning that it's entirely reasonable to believe it will lose. This isn't pessimism, it's mathematical wisdom. You can confidently predict the failure of ticket number 1, ticket number 2, ticket number 1000, and so on through every single ticket in the drawing. Yet this same logic that applies to each individual ticket seems to crumble when we step back and consider them all together, because we know with equal certainty that some ticket must emerge victorious. On one hand, rational thought tells you to dismiss each ticket's chances individually. The mathematics are unforgiving. Millions to 1 against, odds so steep they approach impossibility. You wouldn't bet your rent money expecting to win, wouldn't quit your job in anticipation of sudden wealth. The reasonable person acknowledges that their ticket, like virtually every other ticket, will join the vast majority of losers. This isn't cynicism speaking, but probability itself, cold and clear in its calculations. On the other hand, you find yourself confronting an uncomfortable truth about collective outcomes. While you can reasonably believe that ticket A will lose, and ticket B will lose, and ticket C will lose, you cannot extend this logic to conclude that all tickets will lose. Somewhere in this parade of individual failures lies a singular success, an exception that proves the rule while simultaneously breaking it. The very mechanism that makes each ticket a near-certain loser guarantees that one ticket will transcend these same odds. This creates a peculiar tension in rational thinking. You can hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously, that your particular ticket will fail and that some ticket will succeed. Both beliefs are perfectly reasonable, supported by the same mathematical foundation, yet they seem to point in opposite directions. It's as if probability itself has a split personality, incredibly precise when focused on the individual, mysteriously vague when stepping back to view the whole. You begin to wonder whether certainty is more fragile than it appears, whether the very act of zooming in or out can transform truth into paradox. The strangeness deepens when you consider what this means for how we form beliefs about unlikely events. In daily life, you routinely dismiss possibilities with low probability. You don't expect to be struck by lightning, don't worry about winning the lottery, don't plan for extraordinarily rare coincidences. This mental habit serves you well, filtering out anxiety about events too unlikely to merit concern. Yet the lottery paradox suggests there's something incomplete about this approach, some missing piece in how probability translates into belief. Perhaps the paradox points toward a deeper question about the nature of knowledge itself. When you say you know your ticket will lose, what kind of knowledge is this? It's not the certain knowledge of mathematical proof, but rather the practical knowledge of reasonable expectation. You're making a bet on probability, choosing to believe what is most likely to be true. But probability, you discover, is a strange beast, powerful enough to guide decision-making, yet slippery enough to create these moments of logical vertigo where certainty dissolves into contradiction. The lottery paradox whispers something profound about human consciousness and our relationship with uncertainty. We are creatures who crave prediction, who build our lives on expectations of what tomorrow will bring. We plan our days assuming the sun will rise, our commutes expecting familiar routes to exist, our relationships trusting that the people we love will remain recognizably themselves. Yet beneath this practical certainty lies an ocean of probability, where individual events cluster into collective patterns that somehow transcend their own impossibility. Consider how this paradox mirrors other aspects of existence, where the individual and the collective seem to follow different rules. You know that you, personally, will someday die, yet humanity as a whole seems to persist with stubborn continuity. You experience your own consciousness as utterly unique and irreplaceable, yet you share fundamental patterns of thought and feeling with billions of others. The lottery paradox becomes a lens through which to examine these larger mysteries of perspective and scale. There's something almost meditative about sitting with this contradiction rather than rushing to resolve it. Like watching waves approach a shore, you can observe how certainty builds and dissolves, how individual probabilities accumulate into collective inevitabilities. The ticket in your hand becomes less important than the strange alchemy by which millions of tiny impossibilities birth one certain possibility. You begin to see probability not as a tool for prediction, but as a map of mystery, charting the territory where logic meets the irreducible strangeness of existence. The paradox invites you to hold uncertainty more gently, to recognize that some contradictions aren't problems to be solved, but tensions to be lived within. Perhaps wisdom lies not in choosing between individual skepticism and collective faith, but in cultivating comfort with the space between them. In that space, you discover that reality is more flexible than rigid logic suggests, more mystery-laden than pure mathematics implies. As you contemplate your hypothetical lottery ticket one last time, you realize the paradox has shifted something subtle in your relationship with the unknown. It's not about solving the contradiction between individual impossibility and collective certainty. It's about noticing how probability can be both precise and mysterious, both reliable guide and source of wonder, both servant to reason and gateway to the beautiful uncertainty that underlies all existence. Newcomb's problem. Imagine standing before two boxes on a simple wooden table. One box is transparent, revealing a crisp $1,000 bill inside. The other box is opaque, sealed shut, its contents hidden from view. A figure, perhaps a scientist, perhaps something more mysterious, tells you that you can choose to take both boxes or take only the opaque one. They explain that yesterday, based on their prediction of what you would choose today, they either placed $1 million in the opaque box or left it empty. The question hangs in the air like morning mist. Do you trust their prediction of your choice, or do you trust your own free will? This is Newcomb's problem, a thought experiment that has puzzled philosophers and decision theorists for decades. What makes it so unsettling is not just the money at stake, but the way it seems to pit our belief in free will against our desire for the best possible outcome. The predictor, you're told, has an extraordinary track record. They've been right about this choice 90% of the time, or perhaps even more often. Yet the boxes sit before you now, their contents already determined by yesterday's prediction, waiting for your choice. On one hand, the logic seems crystal clear. The contents of the boxes were decided yesterday, before you arrived here. Whatever is in the opaque box is already there, or already absent. Taking both boxes guarantees you get everything that's available, the visible $1,000 plus whatever might be in the sealed box. No rational person would walk away from free money sitting in plain sight. On the other hand, there's the predictor's unsettling accuracy. If they truly can anticipate your choice with near-perfect precision, then choosing both boxes is likely to leave you with only the $1,000 you can see. The predictor, having foreseen your greedy choice, would have left the opaque box empty. But if you choose only the opaque box, demonstrating the kind of trust or faith that the predictor apparently values, you're likely to walk away with the full $1 million. You begin to notice something strange happening in your mind as you consider these options. The very act of thinking about what to choose starts to feel circular, almost dreamlike. If you decide to take both boxes because the contents are already determined, are you proving the predictor right about your predictability? If you decide to take only one box because you want to maximize your expected reward, are you performing exactly the kind of rational calculation that the predictor anticipated? The choice seems to slip away from you even as you reach for it. The deeper you sink into this paradox, the more it reveals about the nature of decision-making itself. Your choice exists in a peculiar relationship with time. It's simultaneously free and constrained, spontaneous and predetermined. The predictor operates like a strange mirror, one that shows not your reflection as you are, but as you will be a moment from now. Standing before these boxes, you're confronting the possibility that your future choice casts a shadow backward into the past. Consider what it means that the predictor is usually right. This isn't just about good guessing or cold reading. For the paradox to have its full force, the predictor must have genuine insight into the mechanics of your decision-making process. They must understand something about the patterns of your thoughts, the weight you give to different considerations, the way logic and emotion dance together in your mind. In a sense, they know you better than you know yourself in this moment of choosing. This knowledge creates a strange intimacy between you and the predictor. They've anticipated not just your choice, but the very reasoning that leads to it. They've foreseen whether you would trust them or doubt them, whether you would act on pure logic or leap into faith. The boxes before you represent their judgment of your character, their assessment of who you are at your core. Choosing becomes an act of either confirming or defying their image of you. The predictor's accuracy also raises questions that ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. If your choices can be predicted with such precision, what does that say about free will? Are you truly deciding, or are you simply playing out a script written by the laws of cause and effect? The boxes sit there patiently, holding not just potential money, but potential answers to questions about determinism and agency that have fascinated humans for centuries. Yet there's something almost peaceful about surrendering to the paradox rather than fighting it. You notice that the urgent need to solve the problem begins to fade, replaced by a quieter curiosity about what the problem reveals. The choice between one box and two becomes less important than the recognition that you're standing at an intersection where philosophy meets psychology, where abstract reasoning encounters real stakes, where the nature of time itself seems to bend. Perhaps the true gift of Newcomb's problem isn't in the choosing, but in the contemplating. As you stand before those boxes, you're experiencing something uniquely human, the ability to step outside your immediate situation and examine it from multiple angles simultaneously. You can hold the logical argument for two boxes in one part of your mind, while holding the strategic argument for one box in another part, not rushing toward resolution, but simply noticing the tension between them. The predictor, in their mysterious accuracy, has created more than just a decision problem. They've constructed a space where the assumptions you usually take for granted become visible, where the relationship between knowledge and choice reveals its hidden complexity. Whether you ultimately reach for one box or two, you carry with you the memory of standing in that space, of feeling the weight of a decision that somehow reaches both forward and backward through time. In the end, it's not about solving the paradox or making the optimal choice. It's about noticing how the problem changes you in the contemplating of it, how it softens the boundaries between logic and intuition, between the determined and the free. The boxes remain, patient and mysterious, holding their secrets, just as the universe holds its deeper questions about choice, knowledge, and the strange loops of causation that connect what we will do with what has already been done. Münchhausen Trilemma. Imagine you're standing in a vast library, surrounded by towering shelves of knowledge that stretch beyond sight. Each book claims to contain truth. Each author promises certainty. And yet, as you pull one volume from the shelf, you discover it references another book for its authority. That book, in turn, points to yet another and another, creating an endless chain of justification that seems to lead nowhere at all. You begin to wonder, if every piece of knowledge must be justified by something else, how can we ever truly know anything at all? This is the heart of the Munchausen trilemma, a philosophical puzzle that reveals the strange predicament we face whenever we try to justify our beliefs. Named after Baron Munchausen, the fictional character famous for his impossible tales of pulling himself out of a swamp by his own hair, this trilemma shows us that all attempts at justification lead to one of three equally problematic paths. We can fall into infinite regress, where each justification requires another justification forever. We can embrace circular reasoning, where our conclusions eventually support their own premises. Or we can accept dogmatic assertions, stopping the chain of justification at some arbitrary point and saying, "This just is." On one hand, infinite regress seems like the honest approach to knowledge. You ask why something is true, and I give you a reason. You ask why that reason is valid, and I provide another. This could continue endlessly, each layer of justification demanding its own support, like Russian dolls nested within one another, shrinking toward an infinitely small core that never quite arrives. It feels thorough, this endless questioning, but it also feels impossible to complete. On the other hand, perhaps circular reasoning isn't as flawed as it first appears. When you trace the logic of mathematics back to its foundations, you eventually find axioms that seem to support each other in a kind of logical circle. When you examine your deepest beliefs about morality or meaning, they often seem to rest upon assumptions that quietly reference themselves. Maybe truth isn't a straight line, but a loop that curves back on itself, creating stability through its very circularity. The third option, dogmatic assertion, might seem like giving up entirely, but consider how much of your daily life rests on unquestioned foundations. You trust that your senses generally tell you the truth about the world around you, not because you can prove this trust is warranted, but because questioning it would make life impossible. You believe in the reliability of memory, the consistency of physical laws, the meaningfulness of language itself, all without ultimate justification. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Munchausen trilemma is how it applies not just to abstract philosophical questions, but to the most practical aspects of human existence. Your career, your relationships, your sense of purpose. All of these rest on beliefs and assumptions that, when examined closely, seem to dissolve into the same three problematic patterns. The values you hold most dear when traced back to their origins either reference other values in an endless chain, circle back to support themselves, or simply assert themselves without further justification. You might find yourself wondering whether this makes all knowledge impossible, or whether it simply reveals something profound about the nature of understanding itself. The trilemma doesn't necessarily destroy the possibility of truth. It reveals that truth might be something different from what we expected. Instead of a solid foundation built on unshakable bedrock, knowledge might be more like a web, where strength comes not from any single strand, but from the intricate patterns of connection between many fragile threads. Consider how this relates to the story of your own identity. Who are you really? You might point to your memories, but those memories are interpreted through the lens of your current self-understanding. You might reference your relationships, but those relationships are shaped by your sense of who you are. You might describe your values and beliefs, but these have been formed through experiences that you remember and interpret as the person you believe yourself to be. The circle completes itself, and yet somehow, mysteriously, you remain. The same pattern emerges when you think about love, that most fundamental of human experiences. Why do you love the people you love? Because of their qualities, you might say. But what makes those particular qualities lovable? Perhaps because they resonate with your own values and experiences. And where did those values come from? From the relationships and loves that shaped you. The justification curves back on itself, and yet love remains real, powerful, transformative. Even time itself seems caught in this strange web of circular justification. You know that time passes because you experience change, but you recognize change only because you have a sense of time passing. The present moment exists in relation to past and future, which exist only as mental constructs within your present awareness. The foundation of temporal experience seems to rest on temporal experience itself. The Munchausen trilemma invites you to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. Perhaps the point isn't to escape the trilemma, but to recognize it as a fundamental feature of conscious existence. Knowledge, meaning, and identity might be less like buildings constructed on solid ground, and more like dancers maintaining their balance through constant, graceful motion. As you let this paradox settle into your awareness, you might notice how it transforms your relationship to certainty itself. The desperate need to find absolute foundations begins to soften. The anxiety of unknowing gradually gives way to a different kind of wonder. The recognition that mystery might be not an obstacle to understanding, but its deepest nature. In the end, the Munchausen trilemma doesn't ask you to solve the problem of justification. It invites you to notice how thinking itself moves in these strange, circular, sometimes infinite patterns. It suggests that consciousness might be less like a spotlight illuminating external objects, and more like a hall of mirrors, where every reflection contains traces of every other reflection, creating something beautiful and coherent despite its apparent impossibility. The trolley problem. Imagine standing on a footbridge overlooking railway tracks, watching a runaway trolley barrel toward 5 people who cannot move out of the way. Your heart pounds as you realize you're holding the only solution in your hands, a lever that could divert the trolley to a sidetrack. But on that sidetrack stands one person, unaware of the approaching danger, 5 lives or 1 life. Your choice will echo through eternity, yet you have only seconds to decide. What makes a choice moral when every option demands a sacrifice? The trolley problem presents us with one of philosophy's most elegant and disturbing thought experiments. In its simplest form, it asks whether you should actively cause the death of 1 person to save 5 others. But beneath this stark arithmetic lies a labyrinth of moral reasoning that has puzzled ethicists for decades. The paradox reveals how our moral intuitions can shift dramatically based on seemingly small changes in circumstance, exposing the hidden contradictions in how we think about right and wrong. You find yourself confronting the first scenario, the basic trolley dilemma. Most people, when presented with this choice, say they would pull the lever. The logic seems straightforward. 5 lives outweigh 1 life. The mathematics of morality appears clear, almost comforting in its simplicity. You're not directly harming anyone. You're simply redirecting an existing threat. But then the scenario shifts, and with it, your certainty begins to waver. Now you're on that footbridge, and the only way to stop the trolley is to push a large person beside you onto the tracks. Their body would stop the trolley, saving the 5 people below, but certainly killing them. The numbers remain the same, 5 lives versus 1, yet something feels fundamentally different. Your hands seem heavier, your breath shallower. The same mathematical equation now feels like murder. This shift reveals something profound about human moral reasoning. When you pull a lever, you feel like you're managing a system. When you push someone, you feel like you're committing an act of violence. The distinction between action and inaction, between indirect and direct harm, creates invisible boundaries in your moral landscape. You begin to see how the architecture of choice shapes the experience of choosing. The paradox deepens when you consider variations. What if the one person is your parent, your child, your closest friend? What if the 5 people are strangers, criminals, or people you dislike? Your moral calculator seems to have variables you didn't know existed. The clean arithmetic of utilitarian thinking, the greatest good for the greatest number, becomes clouded by relationships, emotions, and intuitions you can barely name. You notice how the problem exposes the tension between 2 fundamental approaches to ethics. Consequentialism whispers that outcomes are all that matter. 5 deaths are worse than 1 death, regardless of how those deaths occur. Deontological thinking argues that certain actions are inherently wrong, using someone as a means to an end, actively killing an innocent person. These philosophical schools of thought aren't just academic abstractions. They live in your gut reactions, your sleepless nights, your moments of moral uncertainty. The emotional weight of the dilemma reveals how moral reasoning isn't purely rational. Your immediate response, pull the lever, don't push the person, comes from somewhere deeper than conscious calculation. Evolutionary psychologists suggest we've developed intuitive moral responses over millennia. The act of directly harming someone with your hands triggers stronger aversion than indirect harm through tools or systems. Your moral instincts were shaped by small-scale societies where the distinction between personal and impersonal harm carried real survival significance. Consider how this paradox mirrors the moral complexities you face in daily life. Every resource you don't donate to save lives elsewhere. Every convenience you choose that has environmental consequences. Every time you prioritize your well-being over others' needs. These are versions of the trolley problem. The scenarios may be less dramatic, but the fundamental tension remains. How do you weigh competing moral claims? When is action required? And when is inaction acceptable? The trolley problem also illuminates the role of responsibility in moral thinking. When you pull the lever, you become responsible for the one person's death in a way that feels different from being responsible for failing to prevent 5 deaths. This asymmetry between doing and allowing reveals deep patterns in how humans assign moral blame and credit. You hold yourself more accountable for harm you cause than harm you fail to prevent, even when the outcomes are identical. As you sit with this paradox, you begin to notice how it reflects broader questions about moral certainty itself. Perhaps the discomfort you feel isn't a bug in human moral reasoning, it's a feature. The fact that both choices feel wrong might indicate that you're confronting a genuinely tragic situation where moral values conflict irreconcilably. Not every ethical dilemma has a clean solution. Sometimes being moral means accepting the weight of impossible choices. The beauty of the trolley problem lies not in its answer, but in how it reveals the hidden complexity of moral thinking. You discover that ethics isn't just about following rules or calculating outcomes. It's about navigating the tension between competing moral intuitions. Your discomfort with the dilemma reflects the richness of your moral landscape, where principles, emotions, relationships, and consequences all make valid claims on your attention. In your quieter moments, you realize the trolley problem teaches you something essential about moral humility. The people who find these scenarios easy probably haven't thought deeply enough about them. Moral certainty often indicates moral blindness. The philosophers who created this thought experiment weren't trying to find the right answer. They were trying to understand why the question feels so impossible to answer definitively. You begin to see that the trolley problem isn't really about trolleys or even about life and death choices. It's about the fundamental challenge of being moral in a complex world where your values sometimes conflict, where good intentions can lead to harm, where the right choice isn't always clear. It's about accepting that moral maturity might mean living comfortably with moral uncertainty. The paradox invites you to hold multiple truths simultaneously. You can honor both the utilitarian impulse to minimize harm and the deontological conviction that some acts are inherently wrong. You can feel the pull of abstract moral principles while remaining grounded in particular relationships and emotions. You can strive for moral consistency while accepting that consistency might sometimes be impossible or even undesirable. Perhaps the deepest lesson of the trolley problem is about the nature of moral growth itself. You don't resolve the paradox by finding the right answer. You grow by learning to hold the tension it creates. The discomfort you feel isn't something to eliminate. It's something to honor as a sign of your moral seriousness. It's not about solving the dilemma. It's about noticing how it illuminates the beautiful complexity of trying to live ethically in an uncertain world. Buridan's ass. Imagine standing before two identical doors, each promising something you desperately want. The hallway is silent, the choice yours alone. You reach toward one handle, then pause, your hand hovering in the space between decisions. In this moment of perfect indecision, you've stumbled upon one of philosophy's most enduring puzzles. When faced with two equally attractive options, can the rational mind ever truly choose? This is the essence of Buridan's ass, a thought experiment that places a perfectly rational donkey equidistant between two identical piles of hay. The donkey, being logical, cannot determine which pile is superior, and so it stands frozen, paralyzed by perfect equality. The paradox suggests that pure rationality, taken to its logical extreme, leads not to optimal decision-making, but to complete inaction. What happens when being too reasonable becomes unreasonable? You begin to picture this donkey, standing motionless in a field where geometry has conspired against choice. On one side, a pile of hay beckons with its golden sweetness. On the other side, an identical pile offers the exact same promise. The donkey's mind weighs each option with mechanical precision, finding no distinguishing factor, no rational basis for preference. Every attempt to choose seems arbitrary, and arbitrariness feels like a betrayal of logic itself. The cruelty of the situation reveals itself slowly. The donkey doesn't lack intelligence or desire. It hungers, it knows what it wants, and it can see exactly what would satisfy that hunger. Yet this very clarity becomes a trap. Perfect information creates perfect paralysis. You realize that the donkey's problem isn't too little knowledge, but too much precision in a world that demands imperfect choices. Consider how this mirror reflects your own decision-making struggles. You've stood in restaurants, menu in hand, equally drawn to two dishes. You've faced career paths that seem to offer identical mixtures of promise and uncertainty. In these moments, you become the donkey, your rational mind churning through endless calculations that lead nowhere. The very faculty you trust to guide you, reason, begins to feel like a weight rather than a tool. Yet something deeper stirs beneath this logical gridlock. You notice that in real life, you do choose. You pick the restaurant dish, you select the career path, you walk through one of those identical doors. This suggests that human decision-making operates on principles beyond pure rationality. Perhaps wisdom lies not in perfect analysis, but in the courage to act despite imperfect information. The paradox whispers something unsettling about the nature of free will itself. If every choice requires a reason, and if no reason exists to prefer one option over another, then choice becomes impossible. But if choice is impossible in such situations, then freedom becomes an illusion whenever options appear equally valuable. You find yourself wondering whether true freedom requires a kind of beautiful irrationality, a willingness to leap beyond the calculations. But the donkey's dilemma extends beyond individual choice into the realm of moral philosophy. Imagine two people drowning, equidistant from where you stand, both equally deserving of rescue. The logic of Buridan's ass suggests you might stand frozen, unable to rationally justify saving one over the other. Yet your moral intuition screams that saving either is infinitely better than saving neither. The paradox reveals how pure rationality can sometimes become the enemy of ethical action. This tension between reason and action pulses through many aspects of human experience. In love, you might find two people equally wonderful, equally compatible, equally deserving of your affection. Yet love demands choice, commitment, the courage to say you instead of both. The heart seems to understand something the mind struggles with, that perfection can be the enemy of connection, and that arbitrary choice is sometimes more beautiful than no choice at all. You begin to sense that the donkey's problem might be a problem of perspective. Perhaps the two piles of hay aren't really identical, but only appear so from a very specific viewpoint. Time flows differently for each pile. One exists slightly to the left of the other. One came into being microseconds before its twin. From the universe's perspective, true equality might be impossible. The donkey's paralysis stems from ignoring these subtle differences that, while rationally insignificant, could serve as the foundation for choice. The paradox also illuminates something profound about the nature of preference itself. You realize that rational preference assumes a kind of measuring stick, a common currency by which options can be compared. But what if some choices exist beyond the realm of measurement? What if the very act of choosing creates value rather than simply recognizing it? Perhaps the donkey's mistake is believing that the worth of each pile exists independently of its selection. This leads to a gentle revelation about the relationship between decision and identity. When you choose one door over another, you're not just selecting an option, you're becoming the person who made that choice. The decision shapes you as much as you shape it. The donkey, in refusing to choose, remains forever undefined by preference, forever trapped in the liminal space between possibilities. Choice, even arbitrary choice, becomes an act of self-creation. In the quiet space beyond the paradox, you discover something unexpectedly comforting. The donkey's dilemma, which seemed to threaten the foundations of rational choice, actually reveals the beautiful complexity of real decision-making. Human beings navigate this complexity not through pure logic, but through intuition, emotion, values, and yes, even randomness. We are creatures who can flip coins and call it wisdom, who can trust our gut and call it intelligence. Perhaps the deepest insight isn't about solving the paradox, but about dissolving the assumption that creates it. The idea that rational beings must always have rational reasons for their choices begins to seem like an unnecessary burden. Maybe the most rational thing is sometimes to be irrational, to choose without justification, to act without complete knowledge. In this light, the donkey's paralysis becomes not a failure of logic, but a misunderstanding of what choice really requires. As you drift away from the image of the frozen donkey, you carry with you a strange comfort. The next time you face two equally appealing options, you might remember that the goal isn't to find the perfect reason to choose. The goal is simply to choose, trusting that the act of choosing will create its own meaning, its own rightness, its own path forward into an uncertain but beautiful future. Moral luck. Imagine two friends driving home from the same party, both having had exactly 2 drinks, both slightly over the legal limit, both making the same choice to drive when they shouldn't. One arrives home safely, pulls into their driveway, and sleeps peacefully. The other, through no difference in intention or care, strikes a child who has darted into the street chasing a ball. Their actions were identical, their choices equally reckless, yet one will live with the weight of tragedy while the other faces only the quiet guilt of a poor decision that harmed no one. How can we judge them differently when the only difference was pure chance? This is the puzzle of moral luck. The unsettling idea that factors entirely beyond our control shape how morally responsible we're considered to be. It challenges one of our deepest intuitions about justice, that people should be judged by their intentions and choices, not by the random events that follow in their wake. Yet our legal systems, our relationships, and even our own consciences seem to operate as if outcomes matter morally, as if the universe's dice rolls somehow change the weight of our guilt or innocence. On one hand, it seems obvious that we should only be held responsible for what we can control. Your intentions, your effort, your care, these spring from who you are and the choices you make. If two people act with identical recklessness, identical disregard for others' safety, then surely their moral culpability must be identical too. The child who runs into the street is not a moral agent in either driver's decision. Their presence or absence is pure chance, a roll of cosmic dice that has nothing to do with the driver's character or choices. Yet something in us recoils from this clean, logical conclusion. The driver who kills feels different, doesn't he, than the one who merely risked killing. We see it in their faces afterward, in how they carry themselves through the world. The weight of actual harm seems to change something fundamental about their moral standing. Even they feel it, not just regret for a poor choice, but a deeper, more devastating sense of having become someone they never meant to be. The universe's randomness has somehow reached into their soul and transformed their moral identity. Consider the surgeon whose patient dies on the table, despite flawless technique and preparation. Her colleague, performing an identical operation with identical skill on a patient with an identical condition, watches his patient recover fully. Should we judge them differently? Logic says no, yet the first surgeon may question her calling, may carry doubt and pain that the second never knows. The families certainly judge them differently. One receives gratitude, the other blame, though chance alone determined which patient's hidden vulnerability would prove fatal. This extends beyond matters of life and death into the everyday fabric of how we assess ourselves and others. The parent whose teenager experiments with drugs and emerges unscathed is fortunate. The parent whose child develops an addiction from the same experimentation faces judgment about their parenting, their values, their attention to warning signs. Two managers make the same strategic decision. One benefits from an unpredictable market shift and is hailed as visionary, while the other is undermined by an unforeseeable crisis and labelled incompetent. The paradox deepens when you consider that our very capacity for good and evil choices may itself be subject to luck. The neighbourhood you grew up in, the teachers who shaped you, the genetic lottery that determined your impulse control and empathy, none of these were your choice, yet all of them influenced the moral agent you became. If even our ability to choose well is partly a matter of chance, then what exactly can we take credit or blame for? You begin to wonder whether moral responsibility dissolves entirely under careful examination, or whether it transforms into something subtler and more mysterious. Perhaps the answer lies not in resolving the paradox, but in recognizing what it reveals about the human condition. We are not the autonomous moral agents we imagine ourselves to be, floating free from circumstance and consequence. We are deeply embedded in a web of relationships and random events that shape both our choices and their outcomes. The driver who kills and the one who doesn't are both victims and beneficiaries of moral luck. One suffers the arbitrary weight of consequence. The other enjoys the arbitrary lightness of a harm that didn't occur. This recognition might cultivate a different kind of wisdom. When fortune smiles on you, when your risky choice leads to no harm, when your child navigates dangers safely, when your flawed decision somehow works out, perhaps the appropriate response is not pride, but gratitude. And when you witness others suffering the weight of moral bad luck, perhaps judgment should give way to something closer to compassion, a recognition that their heavier burden could easily have been yours. The paradox of moral luck reveals the strange space we occupy between agency and helplessness. You are responsible for your choices, but you are not the author of their consequences. You can control your intentions and your care, but you cannot control whether a child will dart into the street just as you pass by. This isn't a failure of the moral universe. It's simply the condition of being human, embedded in time and chance and consequence, forever partly responsible and partly at the mercy of forces beyond your control. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider how this paradox might shift your perspective on the moral weight you carry. The mistakes that haunt you, the near misses that could have been tragedies, the times when your best intentions led to unexpected harm. All of these exist in that strange borderland between choice and chance. It's not about solving the paradox of moral luck, but about recognizing how it weaves through every decision, every relationship, every moment, when you must choose how to move through a world you can never fully control. Akrasia. Imagine sitting at your desk on a quiet Sunday evening, a cup of tea growing cold beside you. You know exactly what you should be doing, that important project waiting, the book you've been meaning to read, the call you promised to make. Yet here you are, scrolling through your phone, watching videos you'll forget in minutes, choosing the very thing that brings you neither joy nor progress. You understand what's good for you. You genuinely want to do it, and yet your hands move in the opposite direction. How is it possible to be so divided against yourself? This internal split has a name that echoes through 25 centuries of human puzzlement: akrasia. The ancient Greeks called it the paradox of acting against your better judgment, knowing the good but doing otherwise. Aristotle wrestled with this mystery, wondering how someone could simultaneously possess knowledge and act as if they didn't possess it. It seems to violate something fundamental about human nature, suggesting we're neither fully rational nor completely irrational, but caught in a strange middle ground where wisdom and action drift apart like ships passing in the night. On one hand, you might think knowledge should naturally lead to action. When you know that exercise makes you feel better, that saving money brings security, that calling an old friend strengthens important bonds, surely this knowledge should translate into behavior. It seems almost mechanical. Understanding plus desire should equal action. Yet on the other hand, you've experienced countless moments where this simple equation breaks down entirely. You find yourself doing things you don't even enjoy, avoiding things you genuinely want, creating a gap between intention and reality that feels both mysterious and frustratingly familiar. Consider the moment you decide to wake up early tomorrow. Tonight, lying in bed, the decision feels crystal clear. You can imagine the peaceful morning, the sense of accomplishment, the extra time before the world demands your attention. Your future self seems so reasonable, so capable of making good choices. But when morning arrives, a different version of you emerges, one who experiences those same alarm sounds as an enemy, who finds the warm bed infinitely more compelling than the distant promise of a productive morning. Which version is the real you? The one who decides, or the one who acts? This paradox becomes even stranger when you realize that akrasia isn't just about weakness or lack of discipline. Sometimes you act against your judgment in ways that require tremendous energy and creativity. You might spend hours crafting the perfect excuse to avoid a task that would take 30 minutes to complete. You might develop elaborate systems for postponing decisions you know you'll eventually need to make. There's something almost ingenious about the way you can outmaneuver your own intentions, suggesting that the problem isn't a lack of capability, but something more puzzling about the relationship between different parts of your mind. The ancient philosophers proposed that perhaps you don't really know what you think you know. Maybe when you say you understand that exercise is good for you, you only possess a shallow, intellectual version of this knowledge, not the deep, lived understanding that actually motivates action. It's like knowing the words to a song versus feeling the music in your bones. But this explanation creates its own puzzle. If true knowledge automatically leads to right action, how do you ever acquire this deeper knowledge in the first place? Don't you need to act first before you can truly understand? Modern psychology has mapped this territory with new tools, discovering that your brain contains multiple systems that sometimes cooperate and sometimes compete. There's the part that plans and evaluates and imagines future consequences, and there's the part that responds to immediate circumstances and present sensations. These systems speak different languages and operate on different timescales. When you're planning your week, the rational system is in charge, making sensible decisions about a theoretical future. But when you're actually living through that week, moment by moment, the emotional and habitual systems have much more influence over what you actually do. Yet this scientific lens reveals an even deeper paradox. If you're simply the sum of these competing systems, where exactly is the you that experiences the conflict? When you feel torn between what you should do and what you want to do, who is observing this division? There seems to be a witnessing awareness that stands apart from both the rational planner and the impulsive responder, noticing their disagreement with something approaching compassion. This observer self doesn't always intervene, but it's always present, watching the drama of acrasia unfold with curious attention. Perhaps the paradox points towards something profound about the nature of freedom itself. If you always acted according to your best judgment, you might be more like a sophisticated computer than a conscious being. Your apparent weakness, this ability to act against your own knowledge, might actually be evidence of something irreducibly human about choice. You're not determined by your understanding, nor controlled by your circumstances, but suspended in a space where multiple possibilities remain alive until the very moment of action. This suspension might feel uncomfortable, but it's also where your genuine agency lives. The mystery deepens when you consider that acrasia often involves time. Your present self makes decisions for a future self who feels like a stranger, and your future self inherits choices made by a past self who couldn't fully imagine what it would feel like to live with those consequences. There's an almost poetic tragedy in this temporal displacement. You're constantly making decisions across time for versions of yourself you'll never fully know. The person who decides to diet tomorrow cannot truly anticipate the hunger that the dieting person will feel, just as the person eating the cake cannot quite connect with the regret that follows. In the gentle light of this understanding, acrasia begins to look less like a failure and more like a fundamental feature of consciousness. You're not broken when you act against your better judgment. You're human. The conflict between wisdom and action, between intention and behavior, between different selves across time, this isn't a problem to be solved, but a condition to be recognized. The very fact that you can disappoint yourself proves something remarkable about your capacity for imagination, your ability to envision being better than you are in this moment. Maybe the deepest invitation of acrasia isn't to eliminate the paradox, but to hold it more gently. Instead of judging yourself for the gap between knowing and doing, You might simply notice it with the same curiosity you'd bring to watching clouds change shape. The division isn't evidence of weakness, but of the beautiful, complicated truth that you contain multitudes, rational and emotional, planning and living, deciding and experiencing. In recognizing this, you don't solve a crazier so much as befriend it, finding peace not in perfect consistency, but in the honest acknowledgement of your own mysterious depths. Plato's cave. Imagine you've spent your entire life in a dim basement theatre, watching shadows dance across the wall in front of you. The shapes flicker and shift, sometimes resembling people, sometimes objects, sometimes abstract forms that defy description. You've grown comfortable with this display, learned to predict the patterns, even developed preferences for certain shadow stories over others. But then, someone whispers in your ear, what if everything you're watching is just a reflection of something far more real happening behind you? This is the heart of Plato's cave, a paradox that suggests our entire experience of reality might be nothing more than shadows on a wall. The ancient philosopher presented this allegory to illustrate how human perception can trap us in layers of illusion, each one feeling absolutely real until we discover the deeper truth beneath it. What makes this paradox so unsettling is that it doesn't just question individual facts or beliefs, but challenges the very foundation of how we know anything at all. The setup is deceptively simple. Prisoners are chained in a cave from birth, facing a wall where shadows are cast by objects carried behind them in front of a fire. To these prisoners, the shadows are reality itself. They have no concept that three-dimensional objects exist, let alone that there's an entire world of sunlight beyond the cave. But then one prisoner breaks free, turns around, and begins a journey toward increasingly brighter and more real levels of existence. On one hand, this seems like a straightforward story about education and enlightenment. The prisoner discovers fire, then objects, then emerges into daylight to see the actual world. But on the other hand, the paradox reveals something deeply uncomfortable. If our freed prisoner returns to tell the others what he's discovered, they'll reject his testimony completely. The shadows they've always known will seem more real to them than his descriptions of the sun. You begin to realize the cruel irony embedded here. The very act of gaining knowledge isolates you from those who remain in ignorance. The freed prisoner becomes a stranger to his former companions, unable to convince them of truths that seem obvious to him now. This creates a second layer to the paradox. Enlightenment might separate us from community, forcing us to choose between comfortable belonging and uncomfortable truth. Consider how this plays out in your own experience. Think about a time when you learned something that changed your perception dramatically. Perhaps understanding how advertisements manipulate emotions, or recognizing patterns in relationships you'd never noticed before. Once you saw these deeper mechanisms, could you ever fully return to your previous innocence? The knowledge changed not just what you knew, but who you were. The paradox deepens when you apply it recursively to itself. If we're all potentially prisoners in Plato's cave, how would we ever know it? Any evidence we might gather would itself be part of the shadow world we're trapped within. Our scientific instruments, our logical reasoning, our most careful observations, all of these could be sophisticated shadows cast by realities we can't even imagine. This isn't paranoia, it's the logical conclusion of taking the allegory seriously. Yet there's something almost beautiful about this epistemic humility. The cave paradox doesn't condemn us to despair, but rather invites us to hold our certainties more lightly. You might find yourself looking at your most confident beliefs and asking, what if these are shadows too? What if there are dimensions of reality I haven't even considered yet? This questioning doesn't diminish your experience. It adds layers of mystery and possibility. The emotional dimension of this paradox touches something profound about human longing. We all sense at times that there's more to existence than what we directly perceive. The cave allegory gives form to this intuition, the feeling that beauty, love, truth, and meaning point towards something beyond their immediate appearance. When you watch a sunset and feel moved by more than just the photons hitting your retina, you might be sensing the reality that casts shadows into your perceptual world. But here's where the paradox becomes personally challenging. If there are deeper realities, what's your responsibility to seek them? The freed prisoner in Plato's story experiences pain as his eyes adjust to brighter light. Real enlightenment, the allegory suggests, isn't a comfortable process. It requires leaving behind familiar certainties, enduring discomfort, and accepting the possibility that much of what you've built your identity upon might be illusory. This connects to one of the most persistent questions in human experience: the relationship between knowledge and happiness. The prisoners in the cave aren't necessarily suffering until someone suggests there might be more to reality. Their shadow world provides entertainment, social connection, and a stable sense of meaning. The paradox forces you to ask whether the pursuit of truth is always worth the potential loss of comfort and community. Yet there's also something deeply hopeful embedded in Plato's vision. The allegory assumes that reality has layers, that there are always deeper truths to discover, more authentic ways of being to explore. Your current level of understanding isn't a prison unless you mistake it for the ultimate truth. The cave becomes a trap only when you forget that you might still be looking at shadows. As you consider this paradox in the gentle space before sleep, notice how it reframes the nature of learning and growth. Every breakthrough in understanding can be seen as a small liberation from a cave you didn't know you were in. Every moment of expanded awareness is a step toward whatever forms of reality lie beyond your current perception. The paradox suggests that this journey might be endless, that there might always be deeper caves to escape, brighter lights to discover. Perhaps the real wisdom isn't in solving the paradox, but in letting it soften your grip on certainty while strengthening your commitment to curiosity. You don't need to know whether you're in a cave to appreciate the beauty of the shadows. You don't need to reach final truth to value each step toward greater understanding. The paradox invites you to hold both wonder and humility, both seeking and accepting, as you rest in the mystery of what you can and cannot know. Cognitive dissonance. Imagine standing in front of a mirror, watching yourself practice a lie you know you'll tell tomorrow. Your reflection stares back with perfect clarity, showing you exactly what you're doing. Yet somehow this awareness doesn't stop you. You see the contradiction with crystalline precision. You value honesty, you despise deception, yet here you are, rehearsing words that will betray your own principles. How is it possible to hold two completely opposing beliefs about yourself, to know something is wrong and continue doing it anyway? This is the strange landscape of cognitive dissonance, where your mind becomes a house divided against itself. It's the uncomfortable tension that arises when your actions, beliefs, or attitudes contradict each other, creating an internal friction that feels almost physical. What makes this paradox so fascinating isn't just that it happens, it's how your brain works tirelessly to resolve this tension, often in ways that would surprise you. You wake up each morning believing you're a rational person. You make decisions based on logic, you learn from experience, and you generally try to be consistent in your values and actions. Yet throughout your day, you encounter dozens of moments where this neat picture of yourself begins to fracture. You know that checking your phone constantly is making you anxious, yet you reach for it again. You understand that staying up late scrolling through videos will make tomorrow harder, but you continue watching. You believe deeply in environmental protection, then choose convenience over sustainability at the grocery store. Each of these moments creates a small earthquake in your sense of self. On one hand, you might expect this awareness to automatically change your behavior. After all, if you can see the contradiction clearly, shouldn't you simply choose the path that aligns with your stated beliefs? On the other hand, you begin to notice that knowing and doing seem to operate in different realms of your consciousness, as if they're speaking different languages. Consider the smoker who knows exactly how cigarettes damage the body, who has memorized every statistic about lung disease, who genuinely wants to live a long, healthy life. This person doesn't lack information. They possess more knowledge about the dangers than most non-smokers ever will. Yet, they continue smoking, and somehow their mind finds ways to make this behavior feel less contradictory. Perhaps they tell themselves they'll quit next month, or that their grandfather smoked until 90, or that the stress of quitting would be worse than the smoking itself. None of these thoughts would fool an outside observer, but they serve a crucial function. They reduce the psychological discomfort of holding contradictory positions. Your brain, it turns out, is less interested in truth than in comfort. When faced with information that challenges your existing beliefs or behaviors, your mind becomes remarkably creative in finding ways to dismiss, rationalize, or reframe that information. This isn't a character flaw. It's a fundamental feature of human psychology, as automatic as breathing. You can observe this mechanism in moments large and small. The person who considers themselves generous but walks past someone asking for help might suddenly focus on the possibility of being scammed. The individual who prides themselves on open-mindedness but dismisses evidence that challenges their political views might question the source rather than the substance. The parent who values presence but spends dinner scrolling through emails might convince themselves they're modeling good work ethic. But here's where the paradox deepens. The very act of recognizing these patterns in yourself requires a kind of split consciousness. You must simultaneously be the person experiencing the dissonance and the observer watching it unfold. You become both the magician and the audience member who sees through the trick. This dual awareness brings you to an interesting crossroads. You can use your recognition of cognitive dissonance to berate yourself for being inconsistent, to demand immediate perfection in aligning all your actions with your values. Or you can approach this paradox with a different kind of curiosity, one that wonders about the deeper needs these contradictions might be serving. Perhaps the dissonance isn't always a problem to be solved, but sometimes a signal to be understood. When you find yourself acting against your stated beliefs, what might that action be trying to tell you? Maybe your values need updating. Maybe your circumstances require more compassion for imperfection. Maybe the contradiction is pointing toward a need that you haven't yet learned to honor directly. There's something almost tender about the way your mind tries to protect you from the discomfort of contradiction. Like a parent spinning elaborate stories to help a child make sense of a confusing world, your brain weaves narratives that help you maintain some sense of coherence, even when the pieces don't quite fit together. You begin to see that the goal isn't to eliminate all dissonance. That would require either perfect behavior or perfect ignorance, neither of which seems particularly human. Instead, you start to develop a different relationship with contradiction, one that can hold the tension without immediately rushing to resolve it. This shift feels like learning to be comfortable with uncomfortable weather. You don't pretend the storm isn't happening, but you don't let it define the entire landscape either. You notice the wind and rain while also remembering that skies change, that calm follows chaos, that even contradictions have their seasons. There's a strange peace that comes with accepting that you'll never be perfectly consistent, that your actions and values will sometimes pull in different directions, that knowing better doesn't always translate to doing better. This acceptance doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it creates space for growth that self-criticism rarely provides. As you settle into sleep tonight, you might find yourself thinking about the contradictions you carry. Perhaps you notice them not as failures to be corrected, but as invitations to understand yourself more completely. The paradox of cognitive dissonance isn't something to be solved, but something to be witnessed, like watching clouds shift across an evening sky. It's not about eliminating the tension between knowing and doing. It's about noticing how that tension shapes you, teaches you, makes you more human than any perfect consistency ever could. Confirmation bias. Imagine you're standing in a vast library, searching for a single book that will prove what you already believe to be true. As you walk through the endless rows of shelves, something curious happens. Your eyes seem drawn only to the titles that echo your existing thoughts, while thousands of other volumes fade into an invisible blur around you. It's as if the library itself is conspiring to show you only what you want to see, hiding contradictory wisdom in plain sight. But what if this selective blindness isn't a flaw in how libraries are organized, but rather a fundamental feature of how your mind navigates reality itself? At the heart of human psychology lies a peculiar paradox. The very mechanism that helps you make sense of an overwhelming world also ensures you'll misunderstand it. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in ways that confirm what you already believe. You become a detective who only follows clues that lead to a predetermined conclusion, dismissing evidence that might unravel your case. The strange thing is, this isn't conscious deception or willful ignorance. It's something far more subtle and pervasive. Consider how this unfolds in your daily experience. When you hold a political opinion, you find yourself naturally gravitating toward news sources that validate your perspective. The articles that confirm your views seem more credible, more well-researched, more obviously true. Those that challenge your beliefs appear biased, poorly written, or missing crucial context. Your mind becomes like a sophisticated filter, letting supportive information flow through while catching opposing viewpoints like debris. But here's the paradox. The smarter you are, the better you become at this filtering process, finding increasingly clever ways to dismiss inconvenient truths. The mechanism operates on multiple levels simultaneously. When you encounter new information, your brain doesn't process it neutrally. It immediately begins asking not, "Is this true?" but rather, "Can this be true given what I already believe?" You become more critical of evidence that contradicts your views, demanding higher standards of proof. Meanwhile, you accept confirming evidence with remarkable ease, requiring minimal verification. It's as if your mind employs two different judicial systems, one that presumes guilt for unwelcome facts, and another that presumes innocence for comfortable ones. The scales of justice, meant to weigh evidence fairly, become permanently tilted by the invisible hand of existing belief. This selective processing extends beyond just what information you notice. It shapes how you interpret identical facts. Two people can witness the same event and construct completely different stories about what happened, each genuinely convinced they're being objective. An economic statistic becomes either proof of successful policy or evidence of hidden problems, depending on who's looking at it. A scientific study either validates important truths or reveals the flaws in modern research methodology. The same data becomes clay in the hands of different minds, molded into whatever shape best fits the potter's existing worldview. Memory itself becomes an accomplice in this cognitive conspiracy. Over time, you don't just remember the facts that supported your beliefs. You remember them as being stronger and clearer than they actually were. Details that contradicted your views fade or transform, becoming less vivid and less certain in your recollection. Your past becomes a story edited by your present convictions, with inconvenient chapters mysteriously shortened or rewritten. Each time you recall an event, You're not just accessing a file, you're subtly rewriting it to maintain narrative consistency. The paradox deepens when you realize that being aware of confirmation bias doesn't necessarily free you from it. Knowledge of the phenomenon can even become another tool for selective perception. You might notice confirmation bias in others while remaining blind to it in yourself, or use awareness of bias as a reason to double down on your existing beliefs, assuming that if you know about the trap, you must already be avoiding it. The very attempt to be objective can become another form of subjectivity, like trying to see your own eyes directly. But perhaps the most profound aspect of this paradox lies in recognizing that some degree of confirmation bias might be necessary for psychological functioning. In a world of infinite information and constant uncertainty, the ability to maintain coherent beliefs and stable identity requires some resistance to contradictory evidence. Complete openness to all possible truths might lead not to wisdom, but to paralysis, an inability to act or decide in the face of endless alternatives. Your biased mind might be evolution's solution to the impossible task of being perfectly rational in an overwhelmingly complex world. Consider how confirmation bias interweaves with the fabric of human relationships and social bonds. Shared beliefs create communities, and communities provide meaning, support, and identity. When you encounter information that challenges not just your individual views, but the worldview of your tribe, you're not just questioning facts, you're potentially threatening the social connections that give your life structure and purpose. The choice between being right and belonging is often no choice at all, as the human need for community pulls stronger than the abstract value of objective truth. Yet within this recognition lies a strange form of liberation. Once you accept that complete objectivity might be neither possible nor entirely desirable, you can begin to hold your beliefs more lightly. Like a ship that acknowledges the reality of currents while still attempting to navigate toward its destination, you can recognize your biases without being entirely controlled by them. The goal shifts from eliminating bias to developing a more conscious and flexible relationship with it, noticing when your mental filters are working overtime and occasionally choosing to clean the lens through which you view the world. The invitation isn't to solve the paradox of confirmation bias, but to dance more gracefully with its tensions. You might begin to approach your own certainties with gentle curiosity, asking not just what you believe, but how those beliefs serve you and what they might be protecting you from seeing. You can practice the art of intellectual humility, holding space for the possibility that your perspective is both meaningful and incomplete, both useful and limited. In the end, confirmation bias reveals something beautiful about human nature. Your deep desire to live in a coherent, meaningful world. The fact that your mind works so hard to maintain consistency shows how much you value understanding, even when that understanding is partial. It's not about becoming perfectly objective, but about becoming more aware of the stories you tell yourself and the ways those stories both illuminate and obscure reality. Perhaps wisdom lies not in seeing without bias, but in seeing your bias with compassion, recognizing it as one of the many ways you try to make sense of the endless mystery of existence. The observer effect. Imagine you're sitting alone in a quiet room, watching dust particles dance in a beam of afternoon sunlight. They swirl and drift with seemingly random grace, each speck following its own invisible path through the golden light. But the moment you lean forward to examine one particle more closely, something shifts. Your attention, your very act of watching, seems to change the dance itself. Does the simple act of observing alter what you're trying to observe? This is the essence of the observer effect, a phenomenon that suggests our attention doesn't just record reality, but actively participates in shaping it. In quantum physics, scientists discovered that the mere act of measuring a particle's behavior changes that behavior in fundamental ways. But this paradox extends far beyond laboratory walls, seeping into every corner of human experience where consciousness meets the world it seeks to understand. You begin to notice this strange loop everywhere once you become aware of it. When you watch your own breathing during meditation, the rhythm changes. When you observe your thoughts, they seem to scatter like startled birds. When someone feels your gaze across a crowded room, they turn to meet your eyes, as if summoned by the invisible weight of your attention. On one hand, observation seems like the most passive act imaginable, simply witnessing what already exists. On the other hand, it appears to be profoundly creative, calling new realities into being through the very act of noticing. Consider the parent watching their sleeping child. Their loving gaze doesn't change the child's dreams, yet something in that moment feels transformative. The act of witnessing becomes a form of blessing, a silent transmission of care that seems to travel through space and settle gently around the sleeping form. You wonder if consciousness itself might be less like a camera recording events and more like a tuning fork, resonating with whatever it encounters and causing everything to vibrate at slightly different frequencies. Think about those moments when you've tried to observe your own happiness. The more directly you examine that feeling of joy, the more elusive it becomes, like trying to catch your own shadow. Yet when you stop looking for it and simply live, happiness seems to bloom naturally in the spaces between thoughts. This suggests something profound about the relationship between awareness and experience. That perhaps the most important things in life can only be known obliquely, caught in the corner of consciousness, rather than stared at directly. The paradox deepens when you consider how this applies to relationships. When two people first fall in love, there's often a period where they study each other with intense fascination, trying to decode every gesture and expression. But this very scrutiny can create a strange feedback loop, where each person begins performing for the other's observation, becoming slightly artificial in their authenticity. The real person starts to hide behind the version of themselves they think their lover wants to see. Love seems to require both deep attention and the wisdom to look away at just the right moments. You find yourself wondering about the stories you tell yourself about your own life. When you observe your past, searching for patterns and meanings, do you discover what was always there? Or do you create coherence through the very act of looking back? Memory feels like observation across time, but perhaps it's more like sculpture, each remembering reshaping the past slightly, carving away some details while polishing others until the original experience becomes something both more and less than what actually happened. This brings you to one of the most unsettling aspects of the observer effect, the question of who is doing the observing. When you watch your thoughts, who is the watcher? When you notice your emotions, what part of you stands apart from the feeling itself? There seems to be an infinite regress lurking here. If you can observe the observer, then there must be another observer watching that one, and so on, like mirrors reflecting into each other towards some vanishing point you can never quite reach. Scientists speak of quantum entanglement, where particles become so deeply connected that observing one instantly affects the other, regardless of the distance between them. You begin to suspect that something similar happens in consciousness. When you truly observe another person, not just glancing at them, but really seeing them, perhaps you become entangled in ways that stretch beyond the moment of contact. Their joys and sorrows begin to resonate in your own awareness, creating invisible threads that connect your inner worlds across space and time. The observer effect suggests that the universe might be more interactive than we typically imagine. Rather than being separate from the reality we study, We're woven into it so completely that our attention becomes part of the fabric itself. This isn't mystical thinking. It's a recognition that consciousness and cosmos dance together in ways that make pure objectivity not just difficult, but perhaps impossible and even unnecessary. In your daily life, you start to notice how this plays out in subtle ways. When you observe your breathing with gentle curiosity rather than trying to control it, something shifts. When you watch your thoughts without judgment, they begin to settle naturally, like sediment in still water. When you pay attention to the people around you with genuine interest rather than agenda, relationships deepen in unexpected ways. The quality of your observation seems to matter as much as the act itself. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of the observer effect is how it dissolves the myth of separation between inner and outer worlds. Your consciousness doesn't exist in isolation, peering out at an indifferent universe. Instead, it participates in an ongoing conversation between awareness and experience, between the one who sees and what is seen. Every moment of attention is both discovery and creation, both receiving and giving. As you rest with this paradox, you realize it's not about solving the mystery of observation. It's about learning to participate more gracefully in the dance between consciousness and reality. The observer effect reminds you that you're not separate from the world you're trying to understand, but intimately woven into its ongoing becoming through every moment of awareness. False memory. You're sitting in your childhood bedroom, remembering a summer afternoon when you broke your grandmother's favorite vase. The memory feels crystal clear. The weight of the porcelain in your small hands, the sound of it shattering against the hardwood floor, your grandmother's gentle smile as she reassured you that accidents happen. Years later, you mention this memory to your family, only to discover something unsettling. Your grandmother never owned such a vase, and you were never alone in her house that summer. The memory that shaped your understanding of forgiveness and grace never actually occurred. How is it possible for your mind to construct entire experiences, complete with sensory details and emotional weight, from absolutely nothing? What does it mean when the stories we tell ourselves about who we are rest upon foundations that never existed? Here lies one of psychology's most disorienting paradoxes: false memory, where your brain crafts vivid, detailed recollections of events that never happened. Yet these fabricated experiences can feel more real and emotionally significant than actual memories that have faded with time. Your mind, the very instrument you rely on to navigate reality, regularly authors fiction and presents it to you as historical fact. The paradox deepens when you realize that these false memories don't feel false at all. They carry the same weight, the same conviction, the same power to influence your decisions as any genuine experience from your past. On one hand, memory seems like it should be straightforward, a recording device that captures what happens and plays it back when needed. You remember your first day of school, your first kiss, the day you learned to ride a bicycle, and these memories feel like permanent records of actual events. They form the building blocks of your identity, the proof that you are who you think you are because of what you've experienced. On the other hand, neuroscience reveals that memory works nothing like a recording device. Each time you remember something, your brain reconstructs the experience from scattered fragments stored across different regions, filling in gaps with assumptions, expectations, and influences from your current state of mind. You're not retrieving a file. You're painting a picture from partially remembered brushstrokes, and each time you paint it, it changes slightly. Consider how this reconstruction process opens the door to impossibility. A therapist might ask you to imagine what your childhood home smelled like, and as you conjure up the scent of your mother's cooking, your brain begins encoding this imagined experience as if it were a recovered memory. A friend describes their vacation to Paris in such vivid detail that your mind starts incorporating their experiences into your own memory bank, creating false recollections of walking along the Seine on an evening you actually spent at home. The most unsettling aspect isn't that false memories exist, but that they're often more emotionally powerful than real ones. A woman remembers being lost in a shopping mall as a child. The fear, the tears, the overwhelming relief when her parents found her, except researchers planted this memory through suggestion during a psychology study. Yet this false memory of abandonment and reunion affects how she thinks about trust and safety in relationships, becoming a cornerstone of her emotional landscape, built on nothing but imagination. What emerges is a strange cognitive democracy where truth and fiction compete for the same neural real estate, and your conscious mind has no reliable way to distinguish between them. The memory of your grandmother's vase carries the same phenomenological weight as the memory of your first day at school, even though one is entirely fabricated. Your brain treats both with equal respect, filing them in the same memory systems, allowing them both to shape your sense of self. This paradox extends beyond individual false memories to challenge the very nature of personal identity. If you are the sum of your experiences, but some of those experiences never happened, then who are you really? The stories you tell about your childhood, your relationships, your triumphs and failures, how many of them are unknowing fiction? You might define yourself as someone who learned resilience from overcoming early trauma, not realizing that the trauma was suggested to you years later by a well-meaning but misguided counselor. Yet perhaps there's something profound in this seeming flaw of human consciousness. False memories reveal that your mind isn't simply a passive recorder of events, but an active storyteller, constantly weaving meaning from the threads of experience, imagination, and emotion. The grandmother's vase that never existed still taught you something real about forgiveness. The fear from the shopping mall that never happened still connects you to the universal experience of feeling lost and found. Your false memories become a strange form of inherited wisdom, carrying emotional truths that transcend their factual emptiness. They suggest that meaning-making might be more important to human consciousness than accurate record-keeping. Your brain seems less concerned with archival precision than with creating coherent narratives that help you navigate the world, even if those narratives contain chapters of pure fiction. Consider how this reframes the relationship between memory and truth. Perhaps the question isn't whether a memory actually happened, but what it teaches you about being human. The false memory of your grandmother's gentle response to broken porcelain reflects real experiences of grace and forgiveness you've witnessed or received, even if not in that particular moment. Your mind has taken emotional truths from various experiences and crystallized them into a single, compelling story that never occurred, but somehow captures something essential about love and acceptance. This suggests that consciousness itself might be more of a creative act than an observational one. You're not just experiencing life, you're continuously authoring it, weaving together memory, imagination, and meaning into narratives that feel true because they serve your deeper need to understand yourself and your place in the world. False memories become collaborative fiction between your past and present selves, stories that emerge from the intersection of what happened, what you needed to happen, and what your mind believes should have happened. The paradox softens when you realize that the distinction between true and false memories might be less important than their shared function as building blocks of meaning. Whether the vase actually broke matters less than the fact that your mind reached for this story when trying to understand forgiveness. Whether you were really lost in that mall matters less than how the emotion of that imagined experience connects you to feelings of vulnerability and rescue that shape how you love and trust. In this space between memory and imagination, you begin to see that human consciousness isn't designed for perfect accuracy, but for meaningful narrative. Your false memories aren't bugs in the system. They're features of a mind that values coherence and meaning over mere factual precision. It's not about solving the mystery of which memories are real. It's about noticing how beautifully your mind weaves truth and fiction into stories that help you understand what it means to be human, to love, to lose, and to find meaning in the gentle confusion of being alive.
Split brain phenomenon. Imagine walking through your home in the morning, reaching automatically for your coffee mug with one hand, while your other hand sorts through yesterday's mail. You don't think about coordinating these actions. They simply happen, as if conducted by some invisible maestro within your mind. But what if that maestro were suddenly divided, split into two separate conductors, each aware of only half the orchestra? This is the reality for individuals who have undergone a specific brain surgery, one that severs the connection between the brain's two hemispheres. What emerges from this medical intervention isn't just a treatment, it's a window into one of the most profound paradoxes of human consciousness. The split brain phenomenon reveals something extraordinary about the nature of your mind. You may not be the unified, singular self you believe yourself to be. When the corpus callosum, the bridge of neural tissue connecting your brain's left and right hemispheres, is cut, something remarkable and unsettling occurs. Each half of the brain begins to operate independently, processing information, making decisions, and even developing preferences without the other half's knowledge. Picture this. A person sits before a screen, their hands hidden behind a partition. An image of an apple appears in their left visual field, seen only by their right brain. When asked what they saw, they say nothing, because their left brain, which controls speech, genuinely saw nothing. Yet their left hand, controlled by that silent right brain, reaches out and correctly selects an apple from a collection of objects. On one hand, we witness a person who speaks with complete honesty about seeing nothing. On the other hand, we observe a hand that acts with perfect knowledge of what was seen, which response represents the real experience, the verbal denial or the physical demonstration. You begin to realize that consciousness might not be the seamless, unified experience you've always assumed. Instead, it might be more like two separate streams of awareness, normally so intertwined that they feel like one. Consider how this challenges everything you thought you knew about decision-making. When you choose chocolate over vanilla, who exactly is making that choice? In split-brain patients, researchers have observed moments where the two hands work at cross purposes. One hand reaches for a red shirt, while the other grasps a blue one. Theory of mind. Imagine you're sitting across from someone you've known for years, watching their face as they tell you a story. You notice the slight tightening around their eyes, the way their voice catches on certain words, the pause before they mention a particular name. Without them saying it directly, you somehow know they're holding something back. You can sense the unspoken grief, the carefully guarded hope, the complex web of thoughts and feelings moving beneath their words like currents under ice. This remarkable ability to peer into another's mind, to recognize that behind every face lies an entire universe of consciousness, feels both utterly natural and mysteriously impossible. How do you bridge the gap between your inner world and theirs? How do you know that what you call the experience of sadness bears any resemblance to what lives behind their tears? At its heart, theory of mind presents us with one of psychology's most beautiful paradoxes. You possess an extraordinary capacity to understand that other people have minds like your own, filled with beliefs, desires, intentions, and emotions, while simultaneously being forever locked out of direct access to those very minds. You can predict how someone might feel, anticipate their reactions, and respond to their unspoken needs, all while knowing that their consciousness remains as fundamentally unknowable to you as a distant star. What makes this paradox so compelling is how effortlessly you navigate it every day. and yet how impossible it seems when you really examine it. You look at a crying child and somehow know to offer comfort, even though you've never experienced that particular child's sadness. You understand when someone is being sarcastic, reading layers of meaning that exist nowhere in their actual words. On one hand, this ability seems to require an almost magical leap of imagination. You take the raw data of facial expressions, tone of voice, and behavior, and from these fragments, you construct an entire theory about what's happening inside someone else's mind. It's like trying to understand a symphony by feeling the vibrations through a wall. Somehow, impossibly, you manage to hear the music. On the other hand, theory of mind feels so fundamental to human experience that its absence becomes immediately noticeable. You can sense when someone struggles to read social cues, when they miss the emotional undercurrents that seem obvious to you. This suggests that this mysterious mind-reading ability isn't learned so much as it is developed, like a sense organ growing more refined with use. But here's where the paradox deepens. The better you become at reading other minds, the more aware you become of how often you're wrong. You think you know what someone is thinking, only to discover you've completely misread the situation. A friend's silence, which you interpreted as anger, turns out to be worry about something entirely unrelated to you. The colleague you thought was being dismissive was actually struggling with their own insecurities. This creates a strange dance of confidence and humility. You must believe in your ability to understand others in order to function socially, yet you must also remain open to being wrong about everything you think you know. You live simultaneously with the conviction that other minds are knowable and the recognition that they remain fundamentally mysterious. Perhaps even more paradoxical is how theory of mind shapes the very thing it seeks to understand. When you believe someone thinks well of you, you often behave in ways that invite their good opinion. When you're convinced someone dislikes you, you might act defensively, creating the very negativity you feared. Your theories about other minds don't just interpret reality, they help create it. Consider how this extends to your understanding of yourself. You know your own mind exists, but do you really understand it any better than you understand others? You might assume that your access to your own thoughts and feelings gives you special insight, but how often do you surprise yourself? How often do you act in ways that contradict what you thought you believed or feel emotions you didn't expect? The paradox reveals itself again. The mind that seeks to understand other minds remains largely mysterious to itself. You can observe your own thoughts, but who is doing the observing? You can analyze your motivations, but what motivates that analysis? The very tool you use to understand consciousness, consciousness itself, slips away the moment you try to examine it directly. This creates a beautiful mirror effect. Every time you try to understand someone else's mind, you're also engaging in an act of self-discovery. When you wonder why someone acted as they did, you're really asking what you would need to believe or feel to act in the same way. Empathy becomes a form of imagination where you temporarily inhabit different ways of being human. Time adds another layer to this paradox. The mind you're trying to understand is never static. It's constantly changing, responding, adapting to new information and experiences. By the time you think you've figured out what someone is thinking, they've already moved on to something else. You're always chasing a target that exists only in the moment that's just passed. Yet this temporal aspect also offers a kind of grace. The fact that minds are always changing means that your misunderstandings aren't permanent failures, but temporary misalignments. The colleague who seemed angry yesterday might be perfectly fine today, not because you were wrong about their anger, but because minds, like weather, are always in motion. There's something deeply touching about how we persist in this impossible endeavor. Despite knowing how often you misread others, despite recognizing the fundamental privacy of consciousness, you continue to reach across the void between minds with curiosity and care. Every conversation becomes an act of faith, faith that understanding is possible even if it's never perfect. Perhaps the paradox exists not to be solved, but to keep us humble and curious. The gap between minds that seems like a barrier might actually be a gift. If you could perfectly understand others, would you still find them interesting? Would relationships still hold the mystery that makes them perpetually fresh? Would you still feel compelled to keep trying to connect? In the end, theory of mind might be less about the accuracy of your mental models and more about the courage to keep building them. It's not about solving the puzzle of other consciousness, but about staying engaged with the mystery. The paradox teaches you that understanding doesn't require certainty, and connection doesn't require perfect comprehension. Sometimes, the most profound human moments happen not when you fully understand someone, but when you recognize the beautiful impossibility of ever truly knowing what it's like to be them, and you choose to care about them anyway.
Self-reference effect. Imagine you're looking through an old photo album, searching for memories of your childhood. As you flip through the pages, you notice something curious happening. The photographs that feature you directly, your birthday parties, your school plays, your family vacations where you're front and center, these images seem to glow with a different kind of clarity. The details are sharper in your mind, the emotions more vivid, the stories more complete. But here's where it becomes strange. Are you remembering the actual events, or are you remembering yourself remembering? When you focus on yourself as the center of a memory, does that very act of self-focus change what you're able to recall? This is the heart of the self-reference effect, a psychological paradox that reveals something profound about how your mind organizes and stores information. Simply put, you remember things better when they relate to you personally. But this creates a curious loop. The more you think about yourself thinking about something, the more memorable that something becomes. Your attention to your own mental processes doesn't just observe your memory, it actively shapes it, creating a feedback loop where consciousness turns back on itself like a mirror facing another mirror. On one hand, this effect seems perfectly logical. Of course you'd remember things that matter to you personally. When someone tells you a story about a restaurant you've never been to, it might slip away easily. But when they mention that same restaurant and add that it's where you had your first date, suddenly every detail becomes significant. Your brain treats information connected to your sense of self as inherently more important, filing it away with extra care and multiple retrieval pathways. On the other hand, this creates something deeply puzzling about the nature of memory itself. You're not just a passive recorder of experiences, you're an active participant in determining what becomes memorable. The very act of relating something to yourself changes its weight in your mental landscape. It's as if your consciousness reaches back through time and makes certain moments more real, more substantial, simply by recognizing yourself within them. Consider what happens when you try to remember a conversation from last week. If you recall it as a neutral exchange of information, the details might feel fuzzy and uncertain. But if you frame that same conversation around your own reactions, how surprised you felt, how it changed your opinion, how it reminded you of something from your own past, suddenly the entire memory becomes more vivid and accessible. You've transformed raw information into self-relevant experience. And in doing so, you've actually altered the memory structure in your brain. This reveals something almost magical about human consciousness. You don't just have experiences, you author your relationship to those experiences. When you connect new information to your existing sense of self, you're not simply filing it away, you're weaving it into the ongoing narrative of who you are. Each act of self-reference becomes a thread in a tapestry that grows more intricate and meaningful over time. But here's where the paradox deepens into something almost mystical. The self that you're referencing when you encode these memories, are you sure it's the same self that recalls them later? The you who experienced something yesterday exists now only in memory, and the you who remembers it today is slightly different, changed by everything that's happened since. So when the self-reference effect makes you remember something more clearly, which self is doing the referencing? The past self who lived it, or the present self who recalls it? This creates a beautiful temporal puzzle where memory becomes less like a recording and more like a conversation between different versions of yourself across time. Your past self encodes experiences with self-reference. Your present self retrieves them through self-reference. And somehow in this exchange, meaning emerges. You're not just remembering events, you're maintaining a continuous dialogue with who you used to be. Think about how this works with your most treasured memories. They're not just recordings of what happened, they're stories you've told yourself about what those events meant to you. Each time you recall them, you're not just accessing stored data, you're re-engaging with your own interpretation of your experience. The memory becomes richer, not because the original event was objectively more significant, but because you've invested it with layers of personal meaning. This suggests something profound about the relationship between identity and memory. You are, in many ways, the collection of experiences you've deemed worth remembering through self-reference. But simultaneously, those memories shape who you become, which influences what you'll find self-relevant in the future. It's a feedback loop where consciousness bends back on itself, creating something that's more than the sum of its parts. The self-reference effect reveals that memory isn't a passive storage system, but an active, creative process. Every time you relate something to yourself, you're making a choice about what aspect of reality deserves to persist in your personal narrative. You're not just remembering your life, you're constantly authoring it, deciding which moments get preserved with clarity and which fade into the background. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this paradox is how it dissolves the boundary between remembering and creating. When you use self-reference to encode a memory, you're not just making it more likely to be recalled. You're actively participating in the construction of your own identity. Each act of relating something to yourself becomes both a preservation of the past and a creation of the future self who will carry that memory forward. In the end, maybe the self-reference effect isn't really about memory at all. Maybe it's about something deeper, the way consciousness creates continuity across time, the way meaning emerges from the simple act of recognizing yourself as the common thread running through all your experiences. You don't just remember better when things relate to you. You become more yourself through the very act of making those connections.
The spotlight effect. Imagine you're walking into a crowded coffee shop and suddenly you catch your foot on the threshold. Your arms flail wildly as you stumble forward, catching yourself just before tumbling into a stranger's table. Your cheeks burn with embarrassment as you're certain every single person in that room witnessed your clumsy entrance and is now silently judging your coordination. You can almost feel their eyes boring into you, replaying your awkward moment in slow motion. But here's the strange thing. When you finally muster the courage to glance around, most people are absorbed in their conversations, their laptops, their own small worlds, seemingly oblivious to your dramatic entrance. How is it that you can feel so utterly exposed, so painfully visible, when in reality you've barely registered as a blip on anyone else's radar? This curious disconnect between how observed we feel and how observed we actually are reveals one of psychology's most fascinating paradoxes. The spotlight effect describes our tendency to overestimate how much others notice and judge our appearance, behavior, and mistakes. We walk through life feeling as though we're constantly bathed in a harsh spotlight, with an audience of critics analyzing our every move. Yet simultaneously, we remain largely invisible to others, who are busy living under their own imagined spotlights. It's a paradox that reveals the strange architecture of human consciousness. We are simultaneously the center of our own universe and peripheral characters in everyone else's story. This creates a peculiar form of psychological suffering where we torment ourselves over scrutiny that largely exists only in our minds. On one hand, this heightened self-awareness seems evolutionarily adaptive. Our ancestors who cared about their social standing and reputation were more likely to maintain crucial tribal bonds. Being attuned to how others perceive us helped ensure we wouldn't be cast out from the safety of the group. This internal spotlight served as a social compass, guiding us toward behaviors that would maintain our place in the community. On the other hand, this same mechanism in modern life often becomes a source of unnecessary anxiety and self-consciousness. You worry endlessly about that small stain on your shirt during an important meeting, convinced everyone noticed. You replay a slightly awkward comment you made at dinner, certain it branded you as socially inept in everyone's memory. Yet research consistently shows that others notice and remember far less about our missteps than we imagine. Consider the last time you were in a group setting and someone else made a small social error. Perhaps they mispronounced a word or spilled something on themselves. How long did you think about it afterward? Chances are it barely registered in your memory, if it registered at all. Yet when you're the one making the mistake, it feels monumental, unforgettable, defining. This asymmetry reveals something profound about human perception. We experience our own lives from the inside, with full access to our thoughts, intentions, and self-criticisms. Every internal monologue, every moment of self-doubt, every physical sensation of nervousness amplifies our sense of being watched and evaluated. But others only see our external presentation, and they're simultaneously managing their own internal spotlight drama. The paradox deepens when you consider how this imagined visibility affects our behavior. Knowing we might be watched, we modify ourselves, straightening our posture, choosing our words more carefully, adjusting our expressions. In a sense, the mere possibility of observation changes who we are in that moment. We become performers in a play where we're never quite sure if there's an audience, but we act as though the theatre is packed. Yet this performance creates its own strange feedback loop. The more conscious we become of potentially being observed, the more unnatural our behavior becomes. Self-consciousness breeds the very awkwardness we're trying to avoid. It's as if the fear of stumbling makes us more likely to trip over our own feet. The spotlight effect also reveals how fundamentally alone we are in our own experience, even when surrounded by others. You can be in a room full of people, feeling utterly exposed and examined, while simultaneously being virtually invisible to those around you. This creates a peculiar form of isolation, feeling seen in ways that make you uncomfortable, yet remaining unseen in ways that might offer connection or understanding. Think about how this plays out in our digital age, where the spotlight effect meets actual spotlights. Social media platforms promise to put us center stage, to give us the audience our internal spotlight always told us was there. Yet even online, where our posts and photos are genuinely visible to others, most of what we share disappears into the vast stream of information, noticed briefly if at all. The digital spotlight proves no more reliable than the imagined one. There's something both humbling and liberating in recognizing this paradox. Humbling because it reveals how much of our social anxiety is self-created, how often we're the primary source of our own social suffering. We are both the harsh critic and the vulnerable performer, locked in an internal dialogue that others can't hear and largely don't care about. But it's also deeply liberating to realize that most people are far too busy managing their own internal spotlights to focus intensely on ours. That slightly crooked smile, that imperfect presentation, that moment when you couldn't think of the right word. These loom large in your own awareness, but barely cast a shadow in anyone else's memory. The real freedom comes not from eliminating the spotlight. It seems to be a fundamental feature of self-aware consciousness, but from adjusting its intensity. Like learning to dim harsh stage lights to something warmer and more forgiving. When you can recognize the spotlight as largely illusory, you can begin to move through the world with greater ease, less burdened by imaginary judgment. Perhaps the deepest wisdom of the spotlight effect lies in this recognition. We are all walking through life feeling more visible than we actually are, more scrutinized than reality warrants, more central to others' attention than we could ever be. Once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it, not just in yourself, but in everyone around you. That person who seems so confident might be battling their own imaginary spotlight. That friend who appears effortlessly social might be hyper-aware of every word they speak. It's not about solving the paradox of feeling visible while remaining largely invisible. It's about noticing how this fundamental feature of consciousness shapes your daily experience, and perhaps finding some gentle compassion for the very human tendency to overestimate your own visibility in a world where everyone is managing their own internal stage lights. Dunning-Kruger effect. Imagine you're sitting in a coffee shop, listening to someone at the next table confidently explaining complex economic policy with the certainty of a seasoned expert. Their voice carries no hesitation, no doubt, no acknowledgement that they might be wrong. Yet as you listen more closely, you begin to notice the gaps in their reasoning, the oversimplifications, the missing nuances that any true economist would immediately recognize. You find yourself witnessing something both fascinating and unsettling. Someone who knows just enough to be completely unaware of how little they actually know. What is it about the human mind that makes us most confident precisely when we should be most humble? The Dunning-Kruger effect reveals one of psychology's most elegant paradoxes. Those with the least skill in a domain are often the most confident in their abilities, while true experts tend toward doubt and self-questioning. It's as if knowledge and confidence move in opposite directions, creating a strange inversion where ignorance breeds certainty and wisdom cultivates uncertainty. The very incompetence that should inspire humility instead generates unshakable confidence. You might wonder how such a backward system could exist in our minds. On one hand, it seems almost cruel that nature would design us to be most wrong when we feel most right. The beginner who's read one article about nutrition becomes certain they understand metabolism better than trained dietitians. The person who's watched a few documentaries develops unshakable opinions about complex geopolitical situations. Their confidence feels genuine, even admirable, until you realize it's built on foundations of air. On the other hand, there's something almost protective about this psychological quirk. Perhaps overconfidence serves as training wheels for the human psyche, allowing us to attempt things we'd never try if we fully grasp their difficulty. You've probably experienced this yourself, starting a project with naive enthusiasm, only to discover its true complexity as you progressed. If you had known from the beginning how challenging it would be, would you have ever begun at all? The paradox deepens when you consider that the very skills needed to perform well in any domain are also the skills needed to recognize good performance. It's like needing to understand music to recognize a beautiful symphony, or needing to grasp mathematics to appreciate an elegant proof. The person learning guitar might think they're playing beautifully after mastering 3 chords, not because they're delusional, but because they lack the musical ear to hear the difference between competent and masterful playing. Their incompetence blinds them not only to their own limitations, but to excellence itself. You begin to see how this creates a strange prison of perspective. The less someone knows, the smaller their world of unknown unknowns appears to be. They've climbed a small hill, and having never seen a mountain, believe they've reached the summit of human understanding. Meanwhile, the true expert stands atop a peak high enough to see the vast mountain ranges stretching endlessly beyond, ranges the novice cannot even imagine exist. This inversion reveals something profound about the relationship between knowledge and humility. As your understanding deepens in any field, you don't just learn facts and techniques. You develop an increasingly sophisticated appreciation for what you don't know. The beginning psychology student might feel they understand the human mind after learning about a few cognitive biases. The seasoned therapist, having worked with hundreds of clients over decades, becomes more acutely aware each day of how mysterious and unpredictable human consciousness truly is. There's a strange beauty in watching someone graduate from confident incompetence to humble expertise. You can almost see the moment when their growing knowledge becomes heavy enough to bend their confidence downward, when they realize that every answer they've found has revealed 3 new questions they didn't know to ask. It's like watching someone's intellectual universe expand and their sense of their own place within it proportionally shrink. The effect creates ripples through our social world in ways both frustrating and oddly necessary. In meetings, the person who speaks with the greatest authority is often the one with the least relevant experience. On social media, the most viral takes frequently come from those with just enough knowledge to sound convincing, but not enough to appreciate complexity. Yet perhaps this dynamic serves a purpose. Maybe societies need some people confident enough to act decisively, even if that confidence occasionally springs from ignorance rather than wisdom. You might find yourself wondering where you sit on this spectrum in different areas of your life. The uncomfortable truth is that we're all subject to this effect in domains where our knowledge remains limited. You probably approach some topics with the quiet confidence of expertise earned through years of study and practice, while in others, you might unknowingly display the eager certainty of the beginner. The most unsettling aspect isn't that incompetent people are overconfident. It's that we rarely know which category we're in at any given moment. Perhaps the real invitation of the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't to judge others for their misplaced confidence, but to hold our own certainties more lightly. Every strong opinion you carry might be informed wisdom, or it might be incompetence masquerading as insight. The paradox suggests that the very strength of your conviction could be evidence that you're missing something important, while your moments of uncertainty might indicate you're finally learning enough to ask better questions. As you settle into this strange landscape of knowledge and confidence, you begin to see it less as a problem to be solved and more as a natural rhythm of human learning. Maybe the goal isn't to eliminate the effect, but to dance with it more gracefully, to hold space for both the enthusiasm of the beginner and the humility of the expert. It's not about never being wrong about how much you know. It's about staying curious enough to keep discovering what you don't know. The Mandela effect. Imagine you're sitting in a quiet library, pulling down a book you remember from childhood. You flip to a page that should contain a line you've quoted 1,000 times, only to discover the words are different. Not slightly different, completely different. The certainty you felt just moments before begins to dissolve like sugar in warm water, leaving behind a strange sweetness and an even stranger question. If your memory feels so real, so vivid, so absolutely certain, how can reality contradict it so completely? This is the heart of the Mandela effect, a phenomenon where large groups of people share identical false memories about specific facts, events, or details, named after the widespread false memory that Nelson Mandela died in prison during the 1980s, when he actually lived until 2013. This paradox challenges something we rarely question: the reliability of our own remembering. What makes it particularly unsettling is not that we remember incorrectly, but that we remember incorrectly together, in precisely the same way. You begin to notice how the paradox unfolds in layers. On one hand, memory feels intensely personal and private. Your recollection of a movie quote, a brand name, or a historical event seems to emerge from your own direct experience. On the other hand, when thousands of strangers describe the exact same, incorrect memory with identical details, something larger appears to be at work. The very privacy of memory becomes questionable when it's shared so specifically among people who have never met. Consider the countless examples that have emerged. People remember the children's book series as the Berenstain Bears, rather than the Berenstain Bears. Many recall the actor's name as Louis Anderson instead of Louis Anderson. Others insist that Darth Vader said, "Luke, I am your father," when the actual line is, "No, I am your father." Each memory feels authentic, detailed, confident. Yet each memory contradicts the documented evidence that exists in the world. The strangeness deepens when you realize how these shared false memories cluster around specific types of details. Brand names, movie quotes, song lyrics, geographical locations, details that exist at the intersection of culture and commerce, places where our individual experience meets mass media. You start to wonder whether there's something about how we encode these particular kinds of information that makes them susceptible to this collective rewriting. What emerges is a paradox about the nature of reality itself. If reality is what actually happened, what actually exists, then our memories are simply wrong, and the mystery becomes psychological. But if reality is what we collectively experience and remember, then perhaps these shared false memories point to something more profound about how consciousness and culture intersect. The boundary between subjective experience and objective fact begins to blur in uncomfortable ways. You find yourself questioning the mechanics of remembering. Memory isn't like a video recording that plays back unchanged each time you access it. Instead, every act of remembering is also an act of reconstruction. Each time you recall something, you rebuild it from fragments, filling in gaps with expectations, assumptions, and influences you're not even aware of. The memory you access today is slightly different from the memory you accessed yesterday, shaped by everything that happened in between. This reconstructive nature of memory reveals something beautiful and troubling about human consciousness. We are not passive recipients of experience, but active creators of our own past. Every memory is a small act of storytelling, where your mind weaves together facts, feelings, and narratives to create something coherent and meaningful. But coherence and accuracy, you realize, are not the same thing. The Mandela effect touches something deeper about identity and belonging. When you discover that your memory aligns perfectly with thousands of other people's memories, even when those memories are factually incorrect, you experience a strange form of connection. There's comfort in shared wrongness, a sense that perhaps your experience of reality is not as isolated as you thought. These collective false memories become a kind of accidental community, binding strangers together through their mutual incorrectness. You begin to see how this paradox illuminates the relationship between individual consciousness and collective culture. Perhaps we don't remember alone. Perhaps memory is always, in some sense, social. The stories we tell ourselves about the past are shaped by the stories we hear from others, by the media we consume, by the cultural narratives that surround us. Your memory feels personal, but it was always constructed in relationship with forces beyond your control. The philosophical implications ripple outward like stones dropped in still water. If our most confident memories can be wrong, what does this say about the nature of knowledge itself? If large groups of people can share detailed false memories, what does this reveal about the relationship between truth and consensus? The solid ground of what really happened begins to feel less solid, more mysterious. There's something almost liberating in this uncertainty. The Mandela effect suggests that reality might be more fluid, more participatory than we assumed, not in a mystical sense, but in a profoundly human sense. The world we inhabit is not just the world of facts and objects, but the world of meanings and memories, and perhaps there's more collaboration in the construction of that world than we ever realized. As you settle into sleep, you might find yourself thinking about your own memories differently, not as fixed recordings of what definitely happened, but as living stories that connect you to both your past self and to the mystery of other minds. The paradox of the Mandela effect isn't something to solve, but something to notice. It's an invitation to hold your certainties more gently, to remember that remembering itself is more collaborative and creative than you ever imagined. The bystander effect. Imagine walking through a crowded city street when you notice someone collapse on the sidewalk ahead. Dozens of people stream past, their eyes briefly catching the scene before they continue on their way. Each person assumes someone else will help, someone else will call for assistance, someone else will take responsibility. The strange thing is, the more people present, the less likely anyone becomes to act at all. Why does our willingness to help others seem to diminish precisely the Stroop effect? Imagine sitting in front of a simple list of color names, each word painted in a different hue than what it describes. The word red appears in brilliant blue ink, green shimmers in golden yellow, and purple glows in forest green. You're asked to name the colors you see, not the words you read. And suddenly, your mind stumbles over itself like a dancer who's forgotten the steps to a familiar song. What should be effortless becomes a gentle battle between what your eyes perceive and what your mind automatically reads, leaving you wondering. When did something as simple as seeing a color become so mysteriously complex? This curious phenomenon, known as the Stroop effect, reveals one of the most elegant paradoxes hiding within the architecture of human consciousness. Named after psychologist John Ridley Stroop, who first documented it in 1935, this effect demonstrates how our minds can become delicately tangled between competing streams of information. When the color of ink conflicts with the word it spells, your brain experiences a moment of beautiful confusion. Processing both pieces of information simultaneously, yet finding them impossible to reconcile without conscious effort. On one hand, you possess the remarkable ability to read with such fluency that words leap directly into meaning without conscious translation. Your eyes trace familiar letter patterns, and your mind instantly transforms these symbols into concepts, bypassing the slower, more deliberate process of sounding out each syllable. This automaticity represents years of learning crystallized into something as natural as breathing, a cognitive achievement so profound that you rarely pause to marvel at its complexity. On the other hand, color recognition operates through an entirely different pathway in your brain, one that's both more ancient and more direct than reading. When light reflects off a surface and enters your eyes, specialized cells respond to specific wavelength, sending signals that your visual cortex interprets as red, blue, or yellow. This process unfolds without language, without symbols, connecting you to the world through pure perception rather than learned associations. The beautiful tension emerges when these two systems meet and find themselves pulling in opposite directions. Your reading mind automatically processes blue, while your color detecting mind simultaneously registers yellow.